The story begins with a player with the nickname Rin Amani, fighting a group of level 120 goblins in a D-rank dungeon on the 15th floor, while the kid himself was at level 194. He swung his sword, and the sounds of fierce battle could be heard everywhere. The boy was smiling. Excitement glittered in his eyes. It was just an ordinary trek for him. It turned out that these monsters posed no danger. Soon he was finished. A smile shone on his face. He was satisfied with the work he had done. Such outings gave him great pleasure. He felt alive. Suddenly a voice resounded in his head, notifying him that he had gained experience points. His level had been raised by 1. The kid rejoiced. Finally, a level increase. He waved his hand and opened the status window in front of him. A square window appeared in front of him with many inscriptions that showed his characteristics. The boy began to study them with interest. The level was growing fast enough, but he still had a long way to go to reach the maximum rank. It said that world adventurers were able to reach level 100. More excitement glittered in his eyes. He stood in front of the tablets and scrutinized the leaderboard. These people had become adventurers over 20 years ago. It was presumptuous of him to catch up with them in only a year. The boy pondered. If he wasn't wrong for passing the tangy dungeon, there should be a reward equivalent to a promotion of 5 levels. The structure of the dungeon followed the same type. There was an entrance at the top, further steps down, and a gateway to the dungeon itself. There is only one entrance, and it is on the surface. The reward for the capture depends on the difficulty level of the dungeon, and will also increase depending on the number of people. Many adventurers join groups for the sake of the reward for passing the dungeon. In addition, this way you can defeat the final boss much faster, although it is much more profitable to repeatedly take over dungeons than to defeat monsters and gain experience. But that's impossible. The boy stood in the middle and pondered. Underneath the stairs is a fairly large space called the return area, and a gate leading to a self-dungeon. At the bottom of each dungeon is a room with a boss. If you defeat the boss and capture the dungeon, you can get a reward in the form of a level up. You should have returned after the end of the quest. Capturing a dungeon counts in all dungeons in the world. If a person has captured one dungeon, it cannot immediately capture another dungeon because of the rollback. The rollback lasts for 1 week. But since he's a solo player, he's constantly killing monsters and has never once captured a dungeon. So the time frame isn't really critical for him. Only now, a completely different story. The boy clenched his fist. It was finally happening. He had waited so long for this. When he was a child, a monster escaped from the dungeon and attacked the city. At that moment, he was in a dangerous situation. He remembered a part of his childhood, when he was still a little boy sitting there trembling in fear at the sight of a horrible monster. Next to him sat a little girl who pressed into his shoulder, and also trembled with fear, already prepared for their fate. They closed their eyes, no longer hoping for any help. But suddenly, everything changed. An adventurer appeared out of nowhere and swung his sword, cutting off the monster's head in one fell swoop. The boy looked at this with a rounded look of amazement. He admired the adventurer he had just seen. It was at that moment that the protagonist wanted to become like that man. After graduating from high school, he qualified as an adventurer and entered the dungeon for the first time. In this place, many aspiring adventurers give up and never try again. When someone enters a dungeon for the first time, they can get a skill with a 10% chance. And when a person gets a skill, they can also get a unique skill with a chance. The protagonist wondered, did he really get 2 skills? The sign on the plaque said body enhancement. This skill is given to those who have the talent to develop the body. The second one is dungeon travel, right? What kind of skill is that? He had never encountered such a skill before. The other adventurers crowded around the boy and watched him with admiration, begging him to show them what the skill was. A lot of people, as soon as they saw how the boy got the skill, started to offer him to join their guild. There were so many people around him that it was difficult to hear any particular phrase. Suddenly, among all the other voices, he heard a serious male voice. A man in armor came up to him and looked at him with admiration. He said her name was Shin Kazami. He began to tell us about who they were. They were people with special abilities, and they were recruiting people like themselves to create a new guild. They would like to overtake the top guilds that have been in this world for years. This boy also had unique abilities and was recruiting people with the same. Rin pondered for a moment. Although the idea of overtaking the other guilds wasn't that interesting, but he wanted to rise up with only his own strength. In this concept, their ideas were similar, and so he joined the Kazami Guild. The boy has gained the ability to move in a dungeon. At first level, the ability will move up to 5m cast speed. To move 1m is 10 seconds, and only he can move. Honestly, this skill couldn't be used for support, let alone face-to-face combat. On the other hand, Kazami possessed a unique lightning strike skill. He could calmly control lightning without using his strength. At the first level of the skill, he could match up to 10 beginners. The rest of the guild also possessed incredible skills. Each person had some kind of incredible power. Just a week later, the main character's skill was recognized as the worst. After that, rumors began to circulate about its uselessness. It hit the protagonist's ego pretty hard. The frequent ridicule made him feel embarrassed, and he decided to leave the guild if he doesn't see much progress. But during this time, he was able to increase his dungeon movement skill to level 2. As a result, casting time was reduced from 10 seconds to 8 seconds. When he went to report on his departure, he accidentally overheard them. A conversation could be heard outside the door. Apparently, there was a conversation going on there about kicking the protagonist out of the guild. The voices were quiet, and the boy had to listen. Kazami was there with some girl, and they were talking to each other in a half-whisper. The girl said that she had already spread rumors about the uselessness of the protagonist. Is there any point in forcing him to leave them by spreading such rumors? The protagonist was surprised and disappointed after hearing such a speech. Kazami said that of course it made sense. They were gaining popularity as a guild that was rapidly gaining strength. Their image was an important foundation for everything, and it couldn't be ruined by such weak newcomers. The boy stood outside the door and listened to all this. I was able to say a word. Inwardly, it was as if everything had collapsed. But the guild commander continued as if not noticing him. If they ruthlessly chased him away, it could have an undesirable effect on their guild. The other thing was if he left on his own. Well, now it was all clear to the protagonist. Now he understood everything. The guild members knew about his powers, and they were the ones spreading the rumors. They had no choice but to drive him away. How simple it was. The boy turned around and walked in the other direction at a brisk pace. Inside him was nothing but emptiness and disappointment. But he didn't want to blame them. It was true that he was too weak for this guild. It was only his fault. The next day, he announced his resignation from the team. Kazami started playing with him and denying his departure. But he soon got fed up and finally quit. Then he decided to swing solo. And at that moment, he was invited by another guild. Unfortunately, the boy did not remember its name, but it was very famous. These people wanted to profit from him in the future. But of course, he refused the offer as he no longer wanted to have any comrades. Even if everyone looked at him with contempt, he didn't want to give up. The guy wanted to reach the level of the adventurer he had seen in his distant childhood. It was that desire that drove him forward. Above all, he believed in the power of the dungeon movement skill, believed that it wasn't useless. Many things become stronger when reaching the 10th level. There was hope inside him that it would happen. Well, it was necessary to go on. The guy moved on through the dungeon towards the darkness, but in his soul he had no fear, only confidence and faith in himself. Soon he reached the lower floor of the dungeon. There, two-tailed beast of level 150 was already waiting for him. It was a mixture of a bull and a lion, but it had 2 tails and huge claws on its paws. The protagonist wasn't scared. This was the 3rd time he had defeated a 2-tailed beast. This time the difference in levels was great. It was quite easy for him to defeat this beast. A plaque popped up in front of him with the dungeon capture information. Level increased by 5 units. Rin sighed heavily and looked at the plaque. Now he had level. All the other stats had also increased. That's right. The dungeon movement skill level had been raised to 10. But there was still one question. What would still change after increasing the skill? Transfer distance, casting time, or maybe the area of effect. The boy agonized. But then, in front of him appeared another sign that said that the conditions for using the skill will be changed. Rin gave a surprised look. What does that mean? Still kept dreaming about how his skill would increase. Perhaps then the maximum traveling distance would not be limited. Would the application speed be 0 seconds? Or would the area of effect extend to other people? The guy sighed heavily. Right? That would never happen. He angrily looked somewhere to the side. Will he be able to move to the dungeon he was in before? The dungeon is more than 1 km apart. Isn't it too pointless to move to a place you can't reach? The protagonist sighed. Well, all right. Suddenly there was a familiar sound. It was a signal that the movement magic to return had been activated. It was getting a little dangerous. He should gather the magic stone as soon as possible. Then he would exchange it at the merchant. Could it be that the next time the skill would only be significantly pumped up at level 20? The protagonist was still dreaming of his accomplishments, but he still didn't know how many years it would take him. But there was no choice but to do his best to improve his abilities. He was already tired. He wanted to get home from this labyrinth. His thoughts tormented him and his strength was running low. On the road from underground, a large bridge led into the town, crossing a river. As it rumbled below, it rushed forward in a strong stream. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, and the weather was just fine. Rin walked home at a brisk pace. His mood was completely gone. He ducked his head and without noticing anyone around him just walked forward. His head was still spinning with annoying thoughts that he couldn't get rid of. Dungeon of Purple Sound. He was approaching the entrance, which was a large, tall tower where many other adventurers had already converged. Soon he reached the entrance. This was the first dungeon he had visited as a newcomer. Memories came to mind. The reward here is 1 level, and the monsters are very weak. He's been here several times before. At the entrance of the dungeon, there were already many newcomers who were talking amongst themselves. The guy hesitated and scratched the back of his head. Maybe he should go in again, but he couldn't wait for a week's rollback. Oh well, he's back to square one anyway. It's worth a try after all. The protagonist walked up to the administration window, where a friendly girl was already waiting for him. Smiling, the receptionist said that they had already confirmed the main character's strength. This girl was the manager of the Purple Sound dungeon. He handed her a card with his name and pictures on it. This card records the name and difficulty of the dungeon he has been in. All of this is written down when entering and leaving the dungeon. The girl smiled and thanked him for his cooperation. Lastly, she asked him to be careful. Soon the kid walked up to the door that was the return area from the Purple Sound dungeon. The return area is present in all dungeons without exception. This area becomes the return point when moving out of the dungeon. Roughly speaking, a quick escape. It was behind this gate that the dungeon itself was located. The boy came a little closer and was already thinking of going inside, when suddenly he hit the door as if it were a concrete wall. It was just as he thought. He wouldn't be able to enter the dungeon because of the recent rollback. Without that rollback, he would have been able to gain as much experience as he wanted. But oh well, he had to put up with such conditions. It seems the past adventurers thought so too. They tried to destroy the wall near the gate to make a passage. No matter how powerful their magic was, they couldn't even scratch the wall. But then it was like he realized something. Wait a minute. Could it be that transference is possible in a dungeon where a spellcaster has set foot? The thought struck him like thunder. The boy wondered if perhaps his was not so useless. Would the skill be able to move him inside the dungeon? Maybe he can get through that gate. Although it's not really possible, it's worth a try. In any case, he has nothing to lose. The protagonist looked at the entrance and prepared to use the spell. We need to visualize the place after the gate. Distance 1 meter. Activation time 1 meter, 2 seconds. Rin closed his eyes and concentrating all his magical energy, he cast a spell. Something happened, but for now he didn't dare to open his eyes. Was he really inside? Everything pointed to the fact that he did it. Is it really true? The guy couldn't believe his own success. Now, do I have to wait for the rollback? In other words, he's going to improve a lot. But then he ordered himself to calm down. It's okay though now, there's no point in taking a long time to kill monsters. You can quickly take over the entire dungeon. Hope glowed inside, but for now it was too early for him to rejoice. He needed to go and capture the dungeon. He moved forward with a confident stride. Now things would improve a lot. Now it was necessary to move forward without wasting a moment. An hour later, he was standing near the corpse of the monster he had killed. He was breathing heavily, clutching his blade in his hand. This monster had made him work a little harder. As he stood looking at the top of the caterpillar he had killed, a sign popped up in front of him. a sign that alerted him to the reward for capturing the dungeon. A 1-level increase. The guy was slowly starting to laugh hysterically. Soon he couldn't stand it after all and started jumping up and down and laughing. Yay, he did it. The boy's joy was boundless. More and more sounds were heard, announcing that the level had risen. It's all really true. The guy still couldn't believe it. What happiness. Tears came to his eyes. Would he really succeed now? Now he will be able to repeatedly take over D and E rank dungeons. It is much more effective than killing monsters in A rank dungeons. Because of this, his leveling efficiency would increase many times over. Well, now that he knew that, he had a radiant smile on his face. Into the darkness of the labyrinth, brimming with confidence. After all that, he had captured the dungeon of purple sound again and again. The boy moved forward, and by sunset he had managed to raise as many as 9 levels. Soon he returned to his home. Rin didn't know what was better, continuing to level up or going home. He really wanted to do as much as he could for the day. He couldn't bring himself to go home. But still he had to go back. The main character opened the door of his house. It creaked, and in a quiet voice he said that he had come. But immediately he was scared out of his wits as an object flew at him. He was greeted at the entrance by a girl a little younger than him. It was his sister. She said in a commanding voice that it was getting late, brother. The guy folded his hands in a prayer gesture and began to apologize to her. He said he had gotten carried away with taking over the dungeons. The sister relented and told him to go to the kitchen. There were already a lot of delicious dishes on the table. The girl said she had made it all for him. Rin devoured the food with both cheeks. It was incredibly delicious. Hannah's food is the best thing in this world. The girl looked at him with disdain. He's acting so disgusting. Hearing this, the boy choked on his food. The sister sat down across from her brother and asked him if something good had happened to make him so happy. The boy looked at her and said that he didn't understand what she meant. It was unusual for him to come home late. Something good had happened, though. Today he had been very lucky. The girl asked, "Did it have something to do with the dungeon?" The boy satisfied with a nod. You could tell that all his hard work had paid off. Hannah smiled and said she was very happy for him. And it's well known that the guy has no talent for taking over dungeons, and that's why she's always worried about him. She smiled and said she was happy that everything was fine. He looked lovingly at his sister and thought he was insanely grateful that she was so concerned about him. Memories from his childhood came flooding back to him. A few years ago, their parents had been in an accident, abroad, and had gone missing. Since then, they had been living on the money they had left for their children. It was a small amount. It would not be enough for the rest of their lives. But Hannah continues to support her brother as an adventurer. The guy really can't let her down. Suddenly, the girl shifted her gaze to him and winked. Since his brother is doing well, does he have the strength to challenge a rank C dungeon? The girl's words sounded like a challenge. Now, he could swing much more efficiently. He would be able to capture as many dungeons as he wanted. Hearing that, the guy got a little busy. He wanted to explain something to her, but he stopped himself in time. The protagonist felt that he didn't need to tell her everything now, but his sister was already looking at him with interest, waiting for an answer. A new power that allows you to bypass the obstacle that hinders all adventurers of the world. If this becomes known to the people around him, they will definitely not like it. Because of anger and envy, they may attack the protagonist. The boy wondered, even though this was his little sister, it was better to keep it a secret. Who knows what might happen? Apparently noticing her brother's confusion, the girl looked at him and asked him what was wrong. The guy shook his head and said that it was nothing like that. But unfortunately, he wouldn't be able to capture a dungeon of that rank. The sister laughed and said that she understood perfectly. Rin smiled confusedly and asked, "So why is she asking me that?" And then his sister began to tell him about what had happened at school today. The conversation went on for a long time, into the night. The next day, the boy once again intended to go to the dungeon. He looked at the list of dungeons that were near his house. He sat with his computer and scrutinized the list. When thinking about the efficiency of leveling up, the Tangy dungeon was the best. He could capture it in about 2 hours. The reward of capturing it equaled 5 levels. In a day, he would be able to capture the dungeon about 5 times, therefore that's 25 levels per day. But there are quite a lot of resources in the Tanga dungeon, as well as adventurers. Therefore, there is always someone in the return area. They might notice the protagonist moving around in the dungeon. And in the Purple Sound dungeon, there are few people, but the rewards there are correspondingly less. The boy wondered, when it comes down to it, there had to be some other option. His eyes fixed on the Dungeon of Dreams. It was the best option. The recommended capture level is Dungeon Difficulty Level D rank. Minimum and maximum capture levels from level 100 to all the parameters were perfect for him. However, it is the same in the dungeon wide, and capture will take approximately 3 hours. Hail capture 5 levels. In addition, the difficulty here is a little higher. The main resources that fall here are magic stones. They can be sold for about 10,000 yen. If the protagonist will do 3 rounds a day, he will be able to earn 30,000 yen and raise 15 levels. In other words, it's not a particularly popular dungeon among adventurers. Well, that was exactly why it was the perfect place. The boy's insides boiled with excitement and anticipation of future successes. Soon he approached the entrance to the dungeon. There were almost no people there. As he expected, the dungeon was not very popular. Good thing no one was around. The boy walked to the entrance and prepared to use his dungeon transfer spell. The transfer distance is 1 meter. Casting time will take 2 seconds. Magical energy began to build up around him. It took 2 seconds for the guy to find himself inside the dungeon. It was as damp and wet as ever. Typical dungeon environment. He remembered he'd been here before. If memory served him correctly, it was about 3 months ago. Mostly goblins, kobolds, and gray cave wolves show up in this dungeon. By the way, his favorite dagger, the Dream Dagger, got him here. It is a great weapon, attack 60. It got him Zato that he defeated the boss for the first time alone. The guy heard the familiar sounds of fiddling. Well, the monsters were already here. 2 gray wolves rushed at him. But still, their attack was too slow. The guy could easily anticipate them. Last time, he had a hard time with those gray wolves. But this time, the difference between their levels is colossal. And now they are simply not opponents. After all, this system in dungeons, the main thing is to raise the level. And then, defeating the bosses is just a matter of time. About 3 hours later, the guy found himself in front of large, massive doors that apparently led to the final boss room. He had to work hard to open that heavy door. But after a while, the door creaked open and the guy was faced with the next room with his boss. No one seemed to have fought the monster, and here the guy was chasing luck. He grinned. This time he preferred to fight the boss without being distracted by the remaining monsters. 110 before him was the boss of this dungeon. It was a woman with chicken legs and wings. She looked more like a gargoyle and was staring at the guy. Jesus Christ of Dreams, a harpy. She sings Sleepy Song, but with a high resistance parameter it doesn't work. The most annoying thing is that she can only be attacked when she's on Earth. But this time the guy took the proper measures, and defeating the boss will be easy. He grasped the exploding rock and prepared to throw it at the monster. Explosive stone explodes on impact. It cost 2,000 yen. The kid hit the exact target. As soon as the stone made contact with the monster's body, it let out a violent explosion, and the harpy collapsed to the ground with a scream. Without wasting a second, the protagonist got close to it and stabbed the monster's ugly body with his dagger. It was so fast that I didn't even have time to react, and I just stared at him with my white eyes and gritted teeth. Well, that was very easy. A few seconds later, the boss was already defeated. In front of the guy, the familiar level plate once again popped up. It said that he had successfully captured the dungeon, and as a reward, his level would increase by 5 units. His face lit up with happiness. Great. If it continues like this, it won't be a matter of raising the level. Today, he will take over as many dungeons and as time allows him. Things are shaping up just fine. The guy remembered at the last moment that he hadn't collected the magic stones yet. I almost forgot. It's quite a valuable material, and one of the main rewards in the dungeon. Even if you subtract the cost of the explosive stone, it still remains at a plus. The magic stone cost 10,000 yen, and the harpy stone cost 5,000 yen. Considering the fact that he only spent 2,000 on the explosive stone, the reward was substantial. Well, it was time to leave. He activated the spell and the air around him vibrated. A few seconds later, he was already standing at the entrance. A small breeze whistled around him. Well, he had to keep raising his level. Now with this ability, nothing would be a hindrance to him. Next, he captured the dream dungeon 2 more times. The harpy no longer posed any danger to him at all. He could deal with it in just a few moments. Soon the protagonist's level was. He had risen 15 levels. This was just some incredible speed. The protagonist's joy was unbounded. Being branded as trash with a useless skill, he was tormented by self-blame for his own weakness. But now that Rin was able to awaken this unique skill that was only available to him in the entire world, he was glowing with happiness and proud of himself for having succeeded so well. His name is Rin, and he has a unique dungeon traveling skill. Because of this, he can ignore the dungeon rollback, which is a huge problem for all the adventurers in the world. Soon he was already at his house in his warm room. The boy pondered and looked at his skill chart. Not bad, he had risen in levels a lot. Yesterday he was level 194, and now he was level 224. Sitting on the bed and reviewing his skills, he decided that it was still worth spending those 200 experience points. Unfortunately, he couldn't improve his movement in the dungeon. You can pump body strengthening. This skill increases attack power, stamina, and speed. In close combat it is important, but still he made another decision. His finger pressed on the inventory. He was still wondering what he should spend his points on. With the inventory, he would be able to carry items with him. He wouldn't have to carry them around. He was about to pump up the skill when his sister called him to eat. For the next 4 days, he spared no effort in going through the dream dungeon over and over again. Each time he saw his level increase. His skill and skill level, along with his overall level, grew like yeast. Everything was going so well, but this was too much. He had already raised 150 levels. He was shocked at his progress. Suddenly a hunch flashed through his head. If this was all true, then there wasn't much time left before reaching level 100,000. This thought gave him confidence. But on top of that, there were a lot of big changes while he was trying and pumping up the levels. All of this turned around the next day. The guy came to the entrance of the dungeon and saw a lot of adventurers going inside. The boy watched in amazement at the multitude of people who crowded around the entrance. They were talking about something, and there was an unimaginable noise. There seemed to be a lot of people here on weekends. His dungeon movement skill can be considered cheating. If any adventurers see him using it, it would be a big problem to hide it all. The protagonist realized that he had to be careful. He would need to take a good look before using this skill. He was already on the 5th floor, and going through it all at a pretty good pace. The guy was standing on the lower floor of the dream dungeon. Still, it was better to speed up. Suddenly he heard some incomprehensible rustling behind him and turned around frightened. There were a lot of people running behind them. They were rushing forward in a continuous stream, as if they had been frightened by something. And now they were running away without remembering their fears. The boy listened to hear what these people were talking about. Somebody was yelling that there were too many of them. They couldn't handle them. The protagonist wondered what they were running from. He himself became suspicious. Who knows what could be here? Suddenly a cry for help came from somewhere. Immediately the boy turned and ran in the direction where the scream had come from. I had to use all my speed. When he arrived, he saw the mage girl sitting surrounded by monsters' wolves. The girl was screaming and there was horror in her eyes. She couldn't do anything. It was unlikely that adventurers of such a class went to a dungeon alone. The boy swung his blade to rush forward to the girl's aid. It looked like the people who ran past him were a group, and they had left this poor thing as bait. One of the gray wolves had already rushed over to grab it with its stinking jaws. The girl squeezed her eyes shut and prepared to accept her death. Her whole life began to flash before her eyes. But suddenly, salvation came from nowhere. She opened her eyes, uncomprehending, and saw a strange boy cutting down the wolves one by one with his dagger. Turning to the girl, the protagonist said it was okay. He would help her. The stranger looked at him with eyes wide with surprise. Had her life been saved? She watched with wide eyes as the stranger from nowhere came to her rescue, cutting down the hordes of wolves with a single blow. They seemed to pose no threat to him at all. It was unbelievable. The girl couldn't believe her miraculous rescue. She just sat there, breathing heavily. Finally, the last wolf was defeated. In one swift movement, the boy chopped off its ugly head. After finishing, he put all his stuff in the inventory he had recently purchased at the skill store. He turned to the girl he had just saved. She was just sitting on the bloody floor, staring at her savior with a surprised look, still shaking with fear. The guy smiled kindly and approached her with his hand. He asked if she was all right. Taking a closer look, she seemed pretty to him, even though she was younger than him. The girl suddenly cried out in fear and looked at him with round eyes. Coming to her senses a little, she began to speak quickly. She was fine, just collapsed from fear. The poor woman thanked the protagonist heartily for his help. She gave him a hand and Rin grasped it, pulling her toward him to help her up. The girl was incredibly light, and the boy almost lifted her off the ground. The girl, unable to stand on the blood-slippery floor, started to fall forward, but the protagonist picked her up in time. As soon as she saw the guy's face a few centimeters away from her face, she immediately blushed instantly. Her eyes widened even more. Now she was ready to fall to the ground in shame and embarrassment. After a few seconds, the girl pulled away from him, and in an instant ran to the other end of the corridor, shouting, 160. Rin was embarrassed. Was he really that disgusting? Such a reaction discouraged him a great deal. Apologizing, he decided to help her because of the fact that she was screaming. He didn't know he was so obnoxious to this girl. As soon as she heard that, it waved her hands and shook her head negatively. No. She didn't dislike him at all. On the contrary, she thinks this guy is amazing. She finally came to her senses and her voice turned serious. She thanked the protagonist once more for his help and bowed gracefully. She said her name is Kasai Yui. She will graduate from high school next month. She has been an adventurer since she was 17 years old and visits dungeons on weekends. Currently a high school student. The guy sighed heavily, meaning she was now 17 years old. She became an adventurer a year early, not Voth. He also became one instead of going to university. Apparently noticing the expression on the protagonist's face, the girl looked at him with confusion and incomprehension. Soon he pulled himself together and asked, "Anyway, why is she here alone?" Kasai hesitated. Apparently she was having a hard time finding the words and was embarrassed. But when she got her act together, she told him what the problem was. So she joined the temporary group. Then they went to the dungeon. And when they met a huge pack of wolves, they left her as bait and ran away, right? She sighed noisily. Yes, that's it. It was just as the protagonist had suspected. Intentional victimization by a member of the group was a criminal offense. Anger began to brew inside him. He was even disgusted to hear about it. Such a despicable act. Okay, we had to get this over with. The guy asked her to go together. The girl gladly accepted. Soon they came to the now familiar doors, behind which was the dungeon boss. Kasai shifted her frightened gaze to the protagonist and asked with some doubt, does he really want to challenge the boss? At this time, the guy was wiping his blade as if nothing happened. He nodded his head. Yes, of course, it's the fastest way to leave the dungeon after all. What's wrong with that? The girl shook her head. She said it was okay and she was very grateful to him for saving her. Is it normal for two people to go to the boss? Especially since the guy was fighting a lot of monsters. The doors creaked and started to open slowly. But it seems the protagonist was not at all embarrassed by this. Opening the door, he said that there is nothing wrong with it. I say in a way easy to deal with this boss. Overflowing with confidence, the guy stepped into the room with his boss, before telling the girl not to worry, and asked proudly, who did she think he was? The girl? She looked at him. Suddenly he was embarrassed, and realized he hadn't even introduced himself to her. At this time, the harpy was standing in the distance, looking at the heroes with annoyance. Awkwardly came out, the guy walked up to the girl and lost the back of his head. Her embarrassment said his name is Amani Rin. The girl smiled and said that she too has an acquaintance named Amain, a little embarrassed. She asked if it was okay or the guy if she just called him Rin. No, he was fine with that. The girl smiled and said that if he wanted, he could call her Yui. The kid smiled back at her and said it was a pleasure to meet her. At this point, the harpy had had enough of waiting and rushed at the adventurers with a shout. Rin noticed this and with a single blow sliced the body of the damn monster in half. The monster didn't even make a death sound. Yui watched with admiration as her new acquaintance easily defeated the boss. This was followed by a level increase of 5 units. Now the guy was level. The girl rejoiced. They had finally done it. Yui looked at him with a look full of gratitude. Thanks to him, she had reached level 85. Hearing that, the guy was very surprised. 85? You mean she had a level 80? He began to scrutinize the girl with his gaze. She had managed to get this far at such a low level, it wasn't bad at all. He had thought she was a mage. She was wearing a robe and a staff. The boy came closer and looked at the girl in surprise. The girl looked back at him with an uncomprehending stare. Still gathering his thoughts, the guy asked her, "Is she a healer?" Yui smiled broadly and said that she was. Hearing this, the boy was even more discouraged. Everything was clear now. There are many kinds of adventurers. Mage, swordsman, tank, healer, mage. But healers usually become healers at higher levels. The fact that she could already heal was a huge rarity for healers. Well, it's time to head home. The dungeon boss had been defeated, and now we could leave the dungeon with a clear conscience. We had to collect all the magic stones. Yui walked over to the guy, and they stood on the return zone together. A vortex of magical energy began to form around the protagonists. Now they will return home. A few seconds later, they were already at the entrance now. They were safely back. The girl still couldn't get over the shock. As the two friends emerged from the dungeon, they saw a group of people who looked suspiciously like a dialect, who had thrown a little girl to be eaten by wolves. They were whispering among themselves and seemed to recognize their friend, whom they had so recently left as a victim. I wondered what had happened to her. They had no choice but to sacrifice her. They paid no attention at all to those who had arrived. The friends stood a little apart and listened to them talk. Yui grasped the boy's robe and fearfully took her eyes to the side. She was scared to look her former teammates in the eye. He put his arm around her and told her to stand behind him, that he would handle it. The girl blushed with embarrassment, but she had no choice. Suddenly, the group of people who were whispering among themselves and still noticed the girl, and turned their surprised and dumbfounded gazes in her direction. How did this happen? What would happen next? Rin approached them with a confident gait, the girl hiding behind his back and peering fearfully over his shoulder. One of her former friends looked at her with a look of horror. How did she survive? He remembered perfectly well how they'd left her for the wolves to eat. The man began to shake with fear. He thought he was a ghost. The other man irritably ordered him to shut up. Rin, you noticed that the girl was really scared. Poor thing, she's probably still in shock at what's happening. The man with the bandana on his head smiled a sly smile. I said that she seems to be fine already. In a pretend voice, he said they were worried about her. The protagonists shaded the girl with his hand and ordered the man not to come any closer. The stranger was shocked. Who the hell is this? He didn't understand who this guy was, and his eyes widened in surprise. Rin said that who he was didn't matter. The girl had already told him everything about them, how they had saved the wolves and thrown her as bait. Everyone standing there was horrified and looked towards the two of them with surprised looks. There was no use hiding it. The protagonist should report it to the dungeon manager. The girl faltered and tried to justify herself. She said that the guy was lying. If he told everything, at best they would be stripped of their adventurer's license. The protagonist clenched his hand into a fist as he prepared to attack. It was obvious that there was no way to settle this peacefully now. In addition, the squad leader drew his sword. He swore hard and apparently wanted to kill the man who was about to betray their secret. One of the squad members looked fearfully at their leader and asked what he was doing. The man is furious. He has no choice but to shut that boy up for good. He's already broken the law, and he doesn't want to lose everything he's gained this way. He pointed his sword blade straight at Rin. He ordered his minions to prepare for battle as well. The men apparently did not expect this turn of events and fell into a slight stupor. The man continued, "They must get rid of him before the other adventurers arrive." The boy wondered, and for this, these people are willing to go out this far. He was calm. It did not frighten him at all, for he was prepared for any outcome. The man started to talk him down. He realizes he's an adventurer too, right? He could gain power, glory, and wealth just by conquering the dungeon, right? And once he knew the pleasure of the sign, he would not be able to refuse it. The boy just nodded his head in agreement. He understood that, but he wasn't going to back down. The man smiled and said he was more receptive than he expected. If he served the weapons and apologized to them, he might spare him. But the boy answered firmly, "No." Rin said he thought their conversation was a waste of time. Then they'd better get this over with quickly. The guy stood in front of them, fully confident that he would defeat them. The man went into a rage. Is this what he's letting himself be? He left his sword on him. Yui fearfully peeked out from behind his shoulder and yanked his cloak in an attempt to stop him. The guy smiled back and calmly said that everything would be fine. He didn't know their exact level, but if they were fleeing from ordinary wolves, they wouldn't be heavier than the opponents they met in the dungeon. At this time, a group of people had already prepared to attack. The kid stood in front of them and wasn't afraid of them. They were no danger to him. The squad leader wondered, was he going to fight with his bare hands? Against 4 men? The man laughed. Sorry, but it turns out he was still an idiot. The guy smiled. Is this man so angry that he can't think? Since this girl is here, so how does he think who dealt with the gray wolves? Hearing those words, the man was struck by a thunderbolt. So, has he made up his mind? Does he really not understand what's going on? A magical aura began to form around the boy, but it looked like the man wasn't going to stop. He ordered his companion to prepare to attack. The girl grabbed her staff and used a fireball. A small clot of fiery energy flew at high speed right at the protagonist. But he stood there and didn't even think about moving. An ironic smile flashed across his face. In some ways, he found these attempts somewhat sweet. As soon as the fireball came close enough to him, he deflected it back in the other direction with one hand. It only took away 20 health. The girl was horrified, that was it. He just fought off her attack like that. She couldn't believe it. The guy wasn't going to stop, now it was his turn. He pushed himself off the ground and quickly jumped and began to approach. The squad leader ordered the shield guy to get ready. He readily put up his defense. He thought the shield would help him, but the protagonist was approaching him with great speed. He's seriously going to attack directly. The man applied a reflective strike. The protagonist understood that it was a skill that reflected an attack. It consumed mana reserves depending on the strength of the hit. You just gotta hit harder. The guy exhaled and gathered all his strength in his fist and prepared to punch. There was a cracking sound. The impact was so strong that the shield was immediately covered in cracks and began to disintegrate into small pieces. The man couldn't believe what had happened. One punch to break through the shield. His eyes showed horror and not understanding what was happening. How could this man break through his defenses? The man screamed in fear. Rin smiled and said that it was a simple difference in strength. He just didn't have enough defense points to hold back even one hit. He had a sarcastic smile on his face. He felt his superiority. After that, the man let his guard down, and the guy took advantage of that by punching him in the stomach with all his might. Now his defense was full of gaps. The man exhaled heavily, his eyes darkening. The squad leader didn't understand what the hell was going on here. He came to this dungeon to mock them. This guy was really strong. The kid smiled and said that unfortunately he didn't do that sort of thing. Well, it had to be finished. The squad leader and another girl drew their swords and rushed towards the protagonist. But his speed was so fast that they didn't even have time to hit him. The guy dodged with the dexterity of a magician and delivered a devastating blow. The mage girl stood aside and watched with horror what was happening. She seemed to be numb with fear and just held on to her wand. One of her companions fell beside her. The guy turned to her and calmly asked, did she still want to continue? She just stared at him with dazed eyes, unable to say a word. It was as if everything inside her was shrinking with fear. It finally came to her that they had lost. She let go of her hand, the wand, and she said she was giving up. They had lost. All she wanted now was to keep her life. UEM watched from the sidelines, her eyes wide with surprise. Of the entire team, there was only one girl left. She couldn't do anything herself, so she just raised her hands, and her wand fell to the tiled floor with a resounding thud. Sighing heavily, he did this one. He was getting better and better at it, after they conquered the dungeon and now spanking direction to his home. These people are a simple enough task, but the police and the Adventurers Association have plagued him with questions. They had almost arrived. The city was full of cars and people rushing about their business. The girl was walking beside him and asked in a frightened voice, what will happen to them? The guy replied that according to the dungeon manager, these people would be punished severely. At the very least, they would be stripped of their adventurer's license. Yui stopped and bowed, thanking the guy again for helping her and saving her life. The girl got embarrassed and blushed again. If it wasn't for this man, she doesn't know what would have happened. The boy smiled, looked at her, and said there was no problem. He raised his finger up and said that from now on, a lot of things would change. Let her prepare more thoroughly before going into the dungeon. And besides, let them choose the group more carefully. The girl sighed and shook her head in agreement. Suddenly she remembered something and looked at the boy. She asked if he could give her his contact information. The guy wondered. Why would he do that? She looked at him hopefully and said that she had long wanted to meet an adventurer she could rely on. And besides, she wanted to thank him properly. Hopeful gratitude glittered in the girl's eyes. Well, he wasn't losing anything either way, and the guy gave her his contact info. The girl smiled brightly at him and thanked him. The boy blushed. He was a man who hadn't been given such a carefree smile in a long time. Soon the girls needed to be on their way to the train by now. She waved goodbye and wished him luck. The guy waved back. They said goodbye. She boarded the train, and then it began to move forward with great speed. From under its wheels came a noise that filled the entire surrounding space. The train was like a big caterpillar. The guy was still standing on the platform, looking thoughtfully ahead. Level, it's still not enough. Rin smiled. Well, okay, this still wasn't the end. His smile was full of hope for future accomplishment. The guy looked at all of his skills that he had managed to get in this time. Right now, he had 510 SP dungeon movement skills were now at level 10, and the body strengthening skill was at its maximum level. Level 3 high-speed movement, level 1 inventory. He decided to increase his dungeon skill because it required 500 SP to improve. The dungeon movement skill level was increased to 11. The traveling distance increased by 2.5 times, but he only uses the skill to enter the dungeon, and so there wasn't much difference. Wait a minute. He realized something. Perhaps it would be necessary to try it tomorrow. Night was already gradually releasing on the city. It was already lighting up the sky with bright stars, lighting up with bright colors. Everyone was coming home. The next day, he still approached the entrance to the Dungeon of Dreams the same way. Today was a rare good standing me in front of the entrance. He applied the dungeon movement skill. Now he does this, he'll be able to move between floors of the dungeon. Usually it takes some time to go down once, so it's the efficiency of his pumping increases. He had once thought about it. His maximum travel distance was 5 meters. After that, he didn't have enough MP. Eventually, he realized that there was a possibility of falling down because of the size of the floors. It was out of his reach, but now that he was stronger, this problem could be solved. He should be able to do it. He crouched down on one knee and concentrated magical energy. The distance between floors was 10 meters. 30 MP was needed. It was necessary to set the teleportation distance to 10 meters. He began to move into the dungeon. Leaning on one leg, concentrating all his magic, a magical vortex began to form around him. After a few seconds, he already found himself on the second floor of the Dungeon of Dreams. The guy laughed. Great. Now he should try to move 50 meters at once. For that, he needs 150 MP, and this time, he succeeded. Now he was on the lower floor of the Dungeon of Dreams. The reward for capturing the dungeon is a 5-level increase. He defeated the dungeon boss Harpy again. Well, he took over the dungeon in only 10 minutes. It used to take at least an hour. Now he's going to be pumped up several times faster. Okay, well, that's a start. Now we had to go for a second go-round. Eventually, the kid fell to his knees with no strength. He didn't have enough MP. His supply was almost exhausted, and now his strength was slowly leaving him. Although the stock number was almost 800, but in one lap he would waste 450 MP. He was breathing hard and trying to get himself in shape. It was harder than he thought. There are magic potions that can restore MP, but they're expensive. Shit, isn't there another way and he'll have to give up? The guy started stomping his foot in anger. Wait a minute, what if we reduce the MP consumption? Worth a try now, this time. Need to set the transition distance to 2M. Need MP for this, need 6 MP. Having accumulated the necessary amount of magic, he began to move. The magical haze once again enveloped his body, and soon he shifted. We did it, that's great, so good. The guy couldn't find himself from happiness. He was able to reduce his NP consumption by 5 times. Now he could easily take over the dungeon 7, 8 times in a day. Once again, he reached the final floor, and now he was already fighting a harpy. She was already an opponent that posed no danger to him. Reward: capture the dungeon. And once again, his level increased by 5. Now he had 84 MP left. For today, it was time to call it a day. From now on, he would stick to the strategy he had developed. This way, he would save his strength. The guy opened up his skills table. Now he was level 470 and had accumulated 700 SP. And now it was time to distribute the new skills. Okay, he'll be able to pump much more efficiently from tomorrow. At that moment, he hadn't suspected anything yet. The joy overshadowed all his thoughts. He did not yet know the fact that tomorrow's trek into the Dungeon of Dreams would be his last. He once again fought against ordinary opponents who posed no danger to him. Swinging his sword, he cut down the dungeon dwellers one by one, point by point, counting this time. He had captured the dungeon as many as 17 times today. The lower floor is the Dungeon of Dreams. The gargoyle could no longer resist him. He chopped that boss with a single blow. His skills increased again. In addition, the protagonist gained the title of Dungeon Conqueror. Now he stood alone in the middle of the room with his boss, and didn't know what he should do next. Everything that could be accomplished, he had already accomplished. Most likely no one knows about this method at all. So dungeons don't have a capture limit? It would appear so. He'd better not tell anyone about it so as not to draw unnecessary attention to his person. He did get the title, by the way. He opened the board with his skills and began to scrutinize them. Dungeon Conqueror, rank 1 of 10. The title could only be obtained by completely conquering a dungeon. By conquering a certain number of dungeons, one could get an additional bonus. The kid was interested in this, so he would get bonuses for conquering 10 dungeons. That sounded a bit heavy, but now he had a new goal. In any case, he was thankful for the entire Dungeon of Dreams, for this place had become a kind of experimentation ground for him. Here, he had discovered his new skill for the first time. The next morning, the guy woke up in his house. He still hadn't had time to spend all the SP. The birds were already chirping outside the window, and his sister was looking at him in surprise. He finally woke up. She went over to her brother. I worriedly said that no matter how many times she woke him up, he didn't wake up. She was already afraid he was dead. Replied that it seems that because of yesterday he was very tired. The girl handed him plates with food on them. The boy wondered, "Are you sure this is breakfast?" She cried, and the tears said it was leftovers from last night's dinner. She had made it with such heaviness, but her brother hadn't eaten anything all the way through. They were obviously fake tears. Soon they were sitting at the table eating breakfast. The girl said that since he was so tired, maybe he would take this time off. The guy ate the food offered to him with ecstasy. She asked if the little brother was going to be today. The boy shook his head and said not really, although he wanted to go to the dungeon a little later. His sis was mad at him. He never seemed to hear her. He needed to rest at least once in a while. The boy was covering his head so as not to anger her even more. Good, he understood her perfectly. The girl cared for him so much now he was the happiest man on earth. As soon as the girl heard the fact that he wasn't busy, she cheered up. Great. Then he would go shopping with her as a porter. Rin immediately gloomed and said that he was taking it back now. He didn't feel like resting at all. He had no choice but to go shopping at the market with his sister. She shouted happily that there were pancakes for sale somewhere, but the boy didn't seem to be listening or paying any attention to her at all. He didn't really enjoy going to the market. They went into a shop and bought themselves a pancake. It was incredibly tasty. Sitting down on the bench, they began to eat the treat with gusto. It was incredibly tasty, and the guy's mood even improved a bit. She asked if she could have a taste of her brother's pancake, and without waiting for an answer, she grasped it with her teeth and ate it almost completely. After that, she laughed and said it couldn't be helped, because his pancake was also very tasty. Okay, he could try her pancake, and the girl handed him hers. The boy sighed heavily, and suddenly he heard a familiar female voice. It was Yui. She looked at her brother and sister in surprise and asked in a surprised voice, "Why are the two of them together?" The two looked back at her with the same surprise, and her here they hadn't expected to see. Rin and Hannah looked at each other. The guy asked, "Does she know Yui?" The sister replied that yes, she goes to high school with her, but how does he know her? The guy said he met her in the dungeon the other day. Yui was very embarrassed and said she was sorry. She didn't want to interrupt them. The girl blushed in a flash, turning an embarrassed look to the main character. She said she didn't think they were in such a relationship, but they're a very cute couple. When the guys heard the word steam, they were horrified. The main character put his hand out in front of his face and tried to explain himself. He gestured for her to stop and said that last time she had talked about a friend with the same last name as him, right? So it was Hannah. Finally, the girl realized everything. Her eyes widened wider in surprise. Well, now everything was clear. So they're in a student marriage. When the guy heard that, he was furious. What is she talking about? That's crazy. Sighing heavily as usual, this girl has too many guesses. Rin seemed to have figured it out. This girl had always been like this. Soon to get a little snack and try to clear the air. Because it couldn't be left like this. Yui started to apologize. She rambled that she didn't know they were brother and sister. Rin and Hannah laughed. This situation was quite comical. The guy said he wasn't mad at her at all, let her keep her nose up. My sister confirmed. They are absolutely not mad. Besides, it was fun to watch, but she still couldn't recover from the embarrassment. She felt terribly embarrassed about her arguments. Soon the ice cream was brought to them. Just right in this heat, it stood in 2 neat cups and looked incredibly appetizing. The girl started apologizing quickly again. She still couldn't get over her embarrassment. The 2 girls started eating ice cream. Hannah wished everyone a good appetite. Yui looked shyly at the guy and asked, "Is he sure he didn't want ice cream too?" She had caused so much trouble after all. He smiled and replied that no, they didn't want it. Let her eat it to her heart's content. He just considered it a gratitude for taking care of his sister. At the same time, the girl was eating ice cream with both cheeks. The boy looked at them with rapt attention. The atmosphere was just beautiful. Suddenly, he saw his sister eating all the ice cream in a few seconds. How can you eat so much? Hannah didn't pay any attention to it and only snorted. The girl licked her lips and stretched out in a satisfied smile. After finishing her ice cream, Hannah looked at her brother and asked, "Doesn't he know? Dessert is the only thing a girl can eat forever." The boy looked at her with an angry look. Surely they had eaten pancakes recently. The guy wondered if this girl had 2 stomachs. He brewed himself a strong cup of coffee and began to drink it in small, measured sips. The warmth spread through his body, causing a pleasant shiver. Damn, that was really bitter. Yui asked, "Did the main character go to the same school as them?" This conversation went on for a long time. The guy was getting tired of hearing it all. His sister confirmed that yes, he had been going there for a while. Their new friend listened to these stories with interest. In that case, the girl said that she would call the main character Rin. The boy pulled himself away from his thoughts and nodded his head. He was fine with it. Hannah turned to her and asked why she shouldn't go shopping with them together. Unless she was busy, of course. Excitement gleamed in the girl's eyes. It seemed like she wouldn't care even if she was busy. Yui was embarrassed and then to ask, could she really go with them? The guy said not to worry about anything there. With shopping, his sister usually has a lot of hassle. A little extra help would come in handy. It was perfect. He could get rid of most of his problems that way, but the girls didn't seem to like it. His sister called him a fool, and Yui sweat the look. Thank you, he must be joking, right? Apparently noticing those threatening faces, the guy tensed up. Did he say something wrong? Looks like someone's about to get hit pretty hard. Soon they went to a shoe and clothing store. That's it. Now they wouldn't get out of there for a long time. The younger sister's excited cries could be heard from everywhere. It was a paradise for her. Hannah picked up 2 t-shirts and asked, which one looks better? Yui at that moment came to the jewelry cabinet and started looking at the little pendant. Guy watched it all from the side. The 2 girls had left him behind, and now he was wondering what to do while they were looking at the jewelry. He had absolutely no interest in it. The store aisles were too tedious for him. He finally made the decision to go get a drink, as he was starting to get thirsty. He went to the drink machine and after tossing a coin into it, took out a bottle of cold drink. When he opened the cap, the drink splashed right onto his shirt. The guy was already on his way back and said he was a little late. But suddenly he saw Yui surrounded by some strange guys. He didn't find his sister around. 2 guys were surrounding the poor girl, and apparently offering to let her walk with them. She tried her best to get rid of them, and said she had things to do, but the boys were very persistent dots. Suddenly Rin appeared in front of them and covered the frightened girl with his body. The 2 strangers looked at him in surprise. In a firm voice, he said that this girl was now together with him. Yui looked out from behind his shoulder in surprise. The 2 strangers looked angrily and irritatedly at the boy. What's wrong with him? Soon they got bored and turned around and walked quickly in the opposite direction. It was so easy this time, the guy remembered how last time in the dungeon he had to fight 4 opponents at once, and those 2 immediately retreated. Is everything okay now? He approached the frightened girl and apologized. He didn't want to linger and put her in danger. Yui blushed and said he shouldn't change, it was all her fault. The girl missed her eyes and stared guiltily at the floor. Suddenly, the protagonist's younger sister appeared from somewhere. She too looked confused and upset. Rin couldn't help himself and stroked Yui's head with his hand, and her hair was very soft and fluffy. It was like silk. The girl noticed this and looked at the boy with surprise. He immediately blushed as red as cancer, and with a heavy sigh took his hand away from her head and immediately began to apologize. The situation was very awkward. She's going to be mad at him. The guy immediately fought himself and said he was sorry, but Yui tried to calm him down and said that she didn't mind. Blushing, the girl said in a quietly embarrassed voice that, in fact, she even liked it if he'd still. By now, they were both blushing. The girl started to stammer, and the guy attentive. I listened. The sister was watching all this from the sidelines and chuckled quietly. Amazing, she said, not even realizing they were that close. Rin looked at his sister with a serious look, letting her know to stop bullying. After thinking about it for a bit, the guy frowned and asked what she was holding there. Hannah smirked, the echidna saying she was glad he asked. She solemnly displayed a large ice cream cone, smiling. She said it looked just great, that's why she bought it. Yui and Rin looked at the girl with surprised, confused looks. At this moment, they seemed to be thinking the same thing. Looks like she has 3 stomachs, doesn't it? How does she fit so many sweets in her stomach? The guy watched them from the sidelines and smiled. Inside, he was very happy to have spent a pretty full weekend with his sister and new girlfriend. The next day, he went to the Rank E dungeon, the Purple Sound dungeon. He started pumping up his level again, killing bosses and going through the same one by one. Dungeon movement has been improved to 12th level. The activation time has been reduced from 2 seconds to 1 second. Now it would be easier for him to conquer this dungeon. The boy's eyes glittered with excitement again. By all accounts, this should be true, but still it didn't go as smoothly as expected. He chopped the monsters over and over again. His strength gradually spent, but nothing changed. He hasn't even gotten close to conquering the dungeon at all. And his strength was practically running out, and the next day, the story was the same. Even after 100 runs, it didn't work. He was tired mentally and physically. The guy was on his knees in front of the entrance to the dungeon and had almost completely lost hope. Until this very moment, he had worked hard, even though he was considered trash. He has to do it. The boy clenched his fist naturally through his teeth, anger bubbling up inside him. He lunged at the huge centipede and once again began to fight it hard. Swinging his blade, he chopped its long body. It was almost 200 runs, and all that time the dungeon had become like a home to him. It was only on his 200th run that he was still able to conquer this dungeon. Tears of joy flowed from his eyes. He had finally succeeded. He raised his hands up and began to shout with joy. It took him 4 days to do that. It was a long time, and especially hard. He was breathing heavily and was on his knees. His eyes began to darken from the fact that his strength had almost left his body. When he got home, he sat down at his computer. He had to get his skills right. A status window appeared in front of him. He wondered what he should choose. Besides, there was a new dungeon to find. He thought about it and stared at the status table. This time he will challenge a rank C dungeon. You need to choose a dungeon closer to home, and preferably without monsters throwing over the most suitable option was Kinzaki Dungeons. Recommended level then, he should improve his attack power and speed. Now he can quickly attack and retreat. The rest, he'll spend the rest later. He wanted to try out his battle tactics the next day, but he suddenly jumped up from the bed and remembered something very important. He can't go through this dungeon. How could he forget? So he had to go to the Tangi dungeon, where he spent a whole week practicing on small monsters. He honed his tactics and earned a little over 1 million while only raising 3 levels. Adding up his earnings from dungeon warming, he has about 2 million. He has accumulated his first small fortune. Now the protagonist will be able to take Hannah to the establishment. At the entrance to the dungeon, as usual, a lot of people crowded around, each of them wanting to break in and get valuable rewards as well as raise the level. The protagonist was surprised by such a large number of people. He had never seen so many people in one place before. It turned out that the statistics did not lie. Adventurers of C rank were the most, and he thought it was all a lie. There are only adventurers here with good equipment. Besides, everyone has their own groups. Suddenly, he saw a lot of people staring at one particular group of people. The boy himself turned his gaze to them to see the reason for this admiration. There were shouts of admiration from everywhere, and the people must have respected them very much. Everyone stared at the same group of adventurers. Whispers were heard from everywhere. It is said that each of these people has unique skills. They are monsters who reached level 2000 in just a year. They were invited by many famous guilds, but they refused. What are they doing here? The protagonist looked in the direction of the people, and their faces appeared very much familiar to him. Is it them? A group of people recognized him too, and their leader looked at the guy with a surprised look. With a fake smile, the squad leader looked at him and said hello to the protagonist. Continuing to smile a strained smile, he said that it was rather strange to meet him in such a place. The main character heavily sighed and said that he could say the same thing. His boyfriend's memory flashed back to those moments when the man had invited him into the guild and promised full support. And then, the picture changed to when they secretly decided to kick the guy out of the guild without even saying anything to him. He remembered those moments when he'd stood outside the doors and eavesdropped. He remembered every word the guild leader had said before kicking him out of there. And now he stood in front of him and smiled cheekily, as if nothing had happened. He said it was a very long story, but now he really wanted to get to know the main character. That's okay with him, right? The protagonist replied that unfortunately he had no companions. He was taking over the dungeon solo. When he heard that word, Kazami was very surprised. His eyes widened and his mouth opened slightly. He laughed nervously and told the guy not to joke around like that. If he's going to single-handedly take over this dungeon, he needs to have at least level. Or is he saying he's already reached it? Smiling wryly, the protagonist replied that he was right. Now the man fell even more into a stupor. He couldn't believe his ears. How could this man achieve such success? He laughed again to hide his surprise and said that after he left, he was even worried about the main character. Naturally, that was what it was. Well, since that was the case, he was very glad. And this was where the man lied. Amain asked, "So what are they doing here? It's not like they reached level. Why did their group come to the dungeon?" The man hesitated and sighed heavily. The man said her name is Rei Kurosaki. She's a newcomer, became an adventurer just a couple months ago. Soon this girl came closer to them. The man kept talking. He said that her skill was incredible. That was why he had invited her to join his guild. She would become an indispensable member. Today they are helping her pump up. The guy looked at her with astonishment. She was really very good. The guild commander winked at him. She was able to reach level 500 in just 3 months. Hearing that, the protagonist was even more surprised. Level 500. Wow, that was just unbelievable. But the guild commander interrupted him. Enough talking for today. With feigned politeness, they wished each other good luck and went about their business. Rin sighed heavily. They were finally done. This conversation was beginning to bore him very much. But suddenly, he shifted his gaze to the side and saw something strange behind him. There stood that rookie girl. She was drilling him with her cold stare. The guy was really scared. How did she get behind his back so quickly? What did she even want? His heart began to beat with double the frequency. The girl asked the guy in a cold voice, "Is he Rin Amane?" The guy nodded his head in surprise and fear. Did they know each other? The girl said no. She had only heard about him from Kazami and the rest of the guild. They had said very bad things about him and considered them obstacles to the guild. The guy remembered it all. He was very unpleasant to realize it, but these memories still couldn't leave him. What the hell? Why is she saying that to him? She doesn't read the atmosphere well, maybe she doesn't understand, or maybe she likes to mock. The guy was starting to get a little nervous, but the girl kept looking at him with a serious look. After pausing for a moment, she said that she thought the guild members were soldiers. Hearing that, the guy was really surprised. Why does she think that? The girl replied that she just had an intuition, but she had something to say. She continued to stare at the protagonist absent-mindedly, the gaze making him uncomfortable, and her voice sounded monotonous and cold. The girl said that she felt some kind of strength in him. It's definitely confidence. At least he's not behaving the way a weak person should. 393. The girl missed her eyes, however. There was something else. After thinking for a while, she said she wanted to ask the guy something. He looked at her with a frightened look. What did she want from him? The girl asked about the name of the guild. What did he think of it? That question was very strange. considering the circumstances. What's this about? The protagonist shifted his eyes to the commander of his former guild. The latter was talking about his achievements with great enthusiasm. They are all geniuses with unique abilities. The man's voice sounded proud. In the future, they will reach the pinnacle as possessors of unique skills. In his hands, he was holding some kind of paper bundle. There was a fire burning in his eyes. Based on all this, he decided that the name of their guild would sound like the King of Uniqueness. The guy sighed and said that, to be honest, he found the name incredibly cheesy. The girl clenched her fists and said that she thought so too. Her eyes lit up with joy. The first person to feel what she felt. She was very happy at. It was very strange. Her reaction seemed unusual. But it was easy to explain. Kazami's subordinates always agree with him. No one goes against their superiors. It was disgusting. They shook hands. On this spot, on this day, an association of victims was founded. Victims of the Kings of Uniqueness. Soon, the guy approached the dungeon. This is the C-rank dungeon / it seemed to him that even the air was different here. He cautiously looked up from below, assessing the scale of the dungeon. You go into it. I noticed that even in the corridors here were much larger than in the other dungeons. All that was left was to wait for the monsters to show up. He needed to test his strength to see if he could stand up to them. Well, it didn't take long for the monsters to show up. In front of him stood a few creatures that looked like they're on boars and held stone axes in their hands. The guy used an evaluation spell to find out what these monsters were. The main dungeon was 30 floors of the elite monsters here. The horned rabbit, red boar, and so on were often found. The boss on the lower floors is pretty strong, but the reward is an upgrade to level 20 and a smoke magic stone. It's worth 100,000 yen. The guy smiled. The monsters appeared quite quickly. If one went through this dungeon solo for the first time, one could obtain the Kanzaki sword. It had a strength of 600. The monsters that stood in front of him were orcs. They had a level 400 brown pig-headed demon uses a club and an axe. The attacks are not very fast but powerful. The orcs looked at him and grunted furiously. Well now, his conquest of this dungeon would begin. The boy looked confidently into the white eyes of the monsters. One of the orcs swung his massive axe, and with a battle cry lunged at the kid, who had already prepared his dagger for defense. Indeed, the attacks of these monsters were very slow, and the protagonist was perfectly able to dodge them and hit back. He swung his sword, and was able to deal with it easily. One by one, he chopped down the vile, pig-like monsters, severing their limbs and chopping them in half. Each time the monster got bigger and bigger, they appear literally out of nowhere. Pulling out his inventory, the guy thought of something. In fact, he had stashed something for these critters that he would now see how they liked it. He threw some sort of pebble right into the middle of the pack of orcs. They looked at the object in surprise and grunted. After a moment, a powerful explosion sounded. It seemed to be the explosive stone that had helped him win last time. There was an explosion, and stone shards flew in different directions. Rin rushed right into the thick of things. He was determined to conquer this dungeon. Nothing in the world could stop him right now. Determination glittered in his eyes. Swinging his blade, he cut down the monsters one by one. But the orcs didn't get any smaller. They were coming out of every crevice. And with their fangs out, they rushed straight at the guy and immediately attacked his sword. Magic stones began to fall out of the slain, and the guy would grab them too. Looking at the stone axe, he used an evaluation spell. It was a typical orc weapon. Recommended level 400 strength plus 200. Yeah, this was definitely a C-rank dungeon, with normal monsters dropping weapons stronger than his dagger. His dagger only had a strength of plus 60, and the normal orc axe had a strength of plus... Well, okay, I should have kept it too. The boy threw the axe into his inventory. He wiped the sweat off his base. It had been a long time since he had fought such strong monsters. His health had decreased by 100 units. But so far, everything is going smoothly. In this dungeon, the feeling is completely different. After all, he had come here to raise his level, not to whine. He pulled himself together and moved forward into the dark corridor with full confidence. Danger and bounty awaited him there. Soon he was on the 5th floor of the dungeon. There waiting for him was a small horned rabbit that was approaching him in small hops on the tiled floor. Weird are those horned rabbits. The little critter sat on the floor looking at him with its black eyes. The creature looked very cute. The boy didn't believe that this little beast could be dangerous. He stepped closer to it, but still kept his sword at the ready. But all of a sudden, the cute little beast, as he seemed to the protagonist at first glance, turned into a killing machine. He jumped on him, exposing his sharp horn. The guy, barely at the last moment, was able to expose the dagger for a block. The only thing he regretted now was that he had too little information. He didn't know the inhabitants here. On the face of it, they were deceptive. He had no trouble dealing with the small, furry beast. He chopped it apart with a single blow. The rabbit didn't even have time to think about it before its shredded body fell to the ground. Suddenly, a sign appeared in front of the protagonist that said his level had increased by 1. So the elite monsters are also given levels. Surprisingly, this had never happened before. Each time he was haunted by more and more new discoveries. After some more time, he found himself on the 15th floor of the dungeon. There was a red boar waiting for him. It was also a level 400 wild boar-shaped monster with thick fur. It uses its weight to make its attacks heavy. The skin of this monster is very durable, so it is often used in various equipment. The boar ran at the protagonist with all his might, emitting womb-like roars. The boy managed to dodge. The boar was fast, but his attacks were too straightforward. He tried to strike the monster, but the sword he had didn't do any damage to the monster. It just bounced off its thick skin. Some other weapon had to be used. He couldn't penetrate the boar's thick skin with this small dagger. Well, it was time for the stone axe. That'll do the trick, won't it? Pulling an orc stone axe from his bag, swinging it around, the guy hit the boar right between the eyes with all his might. There was a crunch, and the skull of the beast cracked. The boar's dead body was already lying on the cold floor, dripping with its own blood. In front of the protagonist, the level up sign flashed again. He really wanted to take this boar with him as a trophy, but it was still very heavy. The boar was just overloading his inventory, standing there with his hands on the side of his head. Still, he couldn't leave such valuable booty here. He really wanted to take it, but he had to make a choice. After all, he would be back here many times. Soon he found himself on the top floor of this dungeon. In front of him were large wooden massive doors. He finally reached the boss room. Behind this door, the final battle awaited him. The boy only pushed the doors a little as they creaked open. The room, the final stage of the battle, stood before him. Slowly he walked into the room. It was completely paved with the same cobblestones as the rest of the dungeon. The boy inwardly braced himself for the fact that he was about to face a rather strong opponent. But that didn't scare him in the slightest. Before him stood a huge orc who held a massive wooden club in his hands. It was similar to the ones he had fought at the very beginning of the dungeon, but it was many times larger. This was the Supreme Orc 600 level orc leader, a giant brown pig-faced monster using a large cudgel and axe as his weapons. Possessing the powerful strength and strike speed of this monster could easily destroy the earth. Without waiting for the guy to react, the monster swung her huge club and brought it straight down to the ground with a loud thud. It sounded like something exploding nearby. Wow. The guy barely had time to jump aside at the last moment. What a powerful punch. This opponent is quite strong. A small hole was formed at the place of impact and cracks spread out in different directions. If he doesn't get his act together, he can lose half his HP in one hit. Even so, he can't sit on the defensive forever. The monster looked at him with its white eyes. Its mouth had huge, sharp fangs. The guy had already clasped his hands. The sounds of the blows of the club were incredibly loud. It was necessary to think of a strategy by which he could defeat this monster. Well, now it was his turn to attack. The guy created a powerful vortex and started running around the monster in circles to confuse the monster. It was quite slow, so the chance of it hitting the target was very small. The Orc King didn't understand. He just watched the guy who was running around him in circles. At this time, the protagonist guessed the right moment to attack. It was now or never. He struck the orc with his club but didn't do any damage. Well, that wouldn't hurt the monster. At this time, the Orc King had already swung his cudgel to strike the annoying guy again. His club came down to the ground again with a loud clang, and shards of rock and earth flew in different directions. At the last moment, the protagonists were able to dodge it by jumping high up in the air. He exhaled heavily and landed nearby. Gathering all his strength into a fist, he prepared to deliver another powerful blow. The boy slammed his blade into the orc's leg to knock it off balance. The monster screamed loudly in pain, so loud that he had to cover his ears to keep from going deaf. That wasn't all. The guy got ready again and started hitting the monster's body with a lot of point-heavy blows. The orc didn't have time to react. The blows rained down on him like rain. The monster threw his huge club at his opponent, but as expected, it didn't hit him. With a loud roar, the monster must have been very annoyed. Well, that wouldn't hurt him at all. The monster roared with all his might, and at the same time, the protagonist was moving at high speed straight at the monster, preparing to kill it with one powerful blow. The boy's face was shining with joy and confidence. He was very happy that he could finally raise his level. He wouldn't just stand still now. He spun his dagger, preparing to plunge it into the monster's body. The orc just watched him with his white, frantic eyes. With a dodge, the guy briefly thrust his sharp dagger straight into the orc's neck. Blood spurted in different directions, and the beast wheezed and fell on its back. Yanking his sword back, the guy slashed the monster's neck, and fountains of blood splashed in different directions. The monster wheezed and let out its last breath and fell on its back. From nowhere, a sign appeared saying that the guy had just defeated the dungeon boss. Level up by 4 units. An invisible voice announced that the protagonist had captured this dungeon. His level has been increased by 20. Rin stood there with his eyes wide open. Did he really win? He hadn't spent a single XP, it was just amazing. He still couldn't get his thoughts in order. The boy thought about it. He really is getting much stronger. Every time his strength increases in some geometric progression. Not quite recently, he could not defeat anyone at all. But now with ease, almost one blow to deal with a huge boss. I had to collect the loot. The magic stone of the Supreme Orcs, this is a cudgel he will need a lot. The High Orc's cudgel, the bludgeon used by the Lord. Level 600 increases attack power by plus 400. This thing is big and heavy and therefore useless. Well, now all that's left is to sell it. The smoke bomb went straight into the inventory, but there was nothing else, he wondered. Is that really all? All the bounty from the boss? His eyes were filled with confusion, as if he had missed something. Is that all? Where's his promised sword? The guy stood in the middle of the boss's room and scratched the back of his head. He didn't understand what he'd done wrong after all. He seemed to have fulfilled all the requirements. We should take another look. He sighed heavily, dissatisfaction settling in his soul. A rather modest reward for defeating such a boss. He stood there, waiting for the teleportation to send him back upstairs. Teleportation would send him back upstairs. Strange, it took so long. Why hasn't it been moved yet? An invisible voice said that passing the first time was confirmed. The guy wondered again. Could this be some kind of system glitch? And what would happen next? He looked around at his surroundings with a frightened and surprised look. The invisible voice continued to dictate new notifications. Passing the dungeon alone is confirmed. Passing using a sword is confirmed. Pass does not possess sword skill confirmed. Guy just looked up and didn't understand what was going on. What are these things? Conditions? Extra boss? Suddenly the space near him began to bubble up. And first a horned head appeared, and then half a body in armor. The boy stood there, watching in amazement. There was a look of fear in his eyes. This has to be some kind of joke. At least I wanted to believe it. In front of him stood a tall knight clad in black armor. It was the Nameless Knight. His level was, this was the additional boss of this dungeon. What's an extra boss? The boy looked at the thing that had appeared in front of him out of nowhere with horror. Were there bosses like this in the dungeon before? Something was definitely wrong. This monster far exceeded his characteristics, so he would be the first to face this boss. The boy stood and watched with fear then as the knight approached him, dragging a huge heavy sword across the floor. Well, he's at with his 808, this guy doesn't stand a chance, but it's up to him to defeat it, or be killed by this thing here and now. The door of the room is locked. It can't be opened until you've defeated it. There was nowhere to retreat. It looked like he had no other choice. He gathered all his will into a fist and tried not to show fear. After all, his life depended on his decision now. Well, okay, he's ready. The boy swung his little dagger and prepared for battle. Swung his sword like he was cutting through space. The knight swung and brought his huge sword down, straight at the protagonist. The boy held onto his small blade, hoping that it would withstand the blow. Their swords crossed. There was a nasty clang of metal. It was very hard to hold back the attacks of this incredibly strong boss. Oddly enough, the protagonist's small dagger still held on. It was necessary to act here and now. At this rate, he would only have to parry the attacks of this boss. His strikes were so strong that it was almost impossible to contain them, especially since the difference in levels was too significant. In addition, the attacks were also very fast. This was not an orc king that could be easily dodged. The knight was incredibly fast, and dodging his attacks was a challenge. The guy realized that right now he was only defending himself. This couldn't go on forever. He couldn't be stuck in this dungeon forever. Something had to be done. It couldn't go on like this. The guy squinted his eyes, and it seemed some cunning plan was born in his head. He thrust his small blade forward, hopefully still able to defend himself against the knight's huge sword. The armor on this boss looked beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Much to the guy's surprise, his small blade was able to withstand the impact of such a powerful weapon. Come on. Is it that durable? It was simply unbelievable. The knight swung his sword in different directions and at one point made a distraction. The guy didn't see the boss bring his foot in to hit him from bottom to top. But fortunately, he reacted at the last moment and put up a block with his hands. The realization flashed in his eyes for a moment that one blow, and he would have to stay here forever. For the first time in his life, the boy was scared that badly. The knight swung around and with all his might, kicked the guy right in the arms. He barely managed to stay on his feet in time to avoid falling to the ground. The blow was incredibly strong, and the recoil threw him back many meters. Rin naturally gritted his teeth. He looked at his health gauge. There was 5.780 of 6.440 remaining. He was able to deal that much damage to him with just one hit, so that's the difference. It was finally starting to dawn on him. His characteristics, this boss is more inclined towards stability and strength. Rin only surpasses this knight in speed, and not by much. Displaying his small blade, the guy said with confidence that there was no way he would lose to such a knight. The boss wheezed, and swinging his huge sword through the air, he struck again. It was like they were doing some kind of death dance. None of them wanted to back down. The protagonist's life was at stake. He skillfully parried and dodged all of the boss's attacks. It took a little more time for him to seize the moment and finally strike. And so, the long-awaited window between attacks. The boy swung his small dagger and put all of his striking power into it. It was the weapon that could keep him alive now. There was a crack of armor, and surprisingly, the huge hand that had the sword in it flew off severed by that dagger. He did it. Now the boss only has a left arm. This will make the battle much easier. It took all his strength to finally defeat him. But suddenly, something happened that the boy never expected. The boss grasped his hand on his arm with the dagger in it and looked at him with his empty armor. Somewhere in the blackness of the armor, a smile appeared. Did he really plan it like that? That was unbelievable. He sacrificed one arm on purpose. What was he planning? The boy held onto his dagger, but the knight dodged and kicked him in the stomach with great force. It was like his insides were turned upside down. His insides started to hurt. It was a monstrous blow. The boy felt as if he'd exhaled his soul with that blow. His breath hitched. His heart began to beat even faster. It seemed that now he was saying goodbye for once in his life. The hardest blow threw him aside, and he hit the heavy wooden door with all his might. He had only 985 health left. He sat leaning against the heavy door, barely breathing. The blow had been monstrous. Now he had very little health left. If he missed even one more hit, he would definitely die. The knight at this time pulled his sword closer to him and prepared to attack again. Apparently, the boss realized that the guy had very little health left. Now he had to strike the last decisive blow. Is this really his end? The boy looked up from the last of his strength. He had already accepted his fate. Would he really die here in this dungeon? But it looked like it was coming. The difference in their strength was simply staggering. It made him laugh. No matter how much he tried to survive, his XP still dipped below. The guy realized that he wouldn't be able to win between them. After thinking for a bit, the guy didn't realize that he still had one more option left. His personal skill, moving in the dungeon, might be his only and last chance for survival. The door is right behind his back. Maybe he could get to the other side of the door. That way he would at least get out of the boss's room. There was just no other way out. He sat leaning on the door and tried to collect his thoughts. It was the best way out. The guy accepted his defeat after all. His own life was far more valuable than some victory. He pulled out his inventory and started fumbling with his hands. He took out a smoke bomb from his pocket, which he had taken from the dungeon boss a while ago. He threw that smoke grenade right at the boss. The knight was walking straight at him like nothing happened. The knight kept coming closer and closer to him with each step. The guy ironically apologized, but the knight would have to wait a bit longer. A smoke grenade flew straight at him. There was an explosion, and the dungeon boss was covered in smoke. It was impossible to see him. He probably couldn't see through the thick smoke either. The knight started swinging his sword in an attempt to catch the boy. Remembered the words that people said to him. He will not make interests out of him there. Let him better find a normal job. The boy gathered all his strength into a fist and used his only spell to move into the dungeon. It was his only chance to stay alive in this unequal fight. Many adventurers had told him, but he put it all in, even though he knew they were partly right. Gave up. All he had in his head was a never-ending quest to be better, to prove himself. That's why he didn't listen to anyone. No matter how stupid he is, if he puts his head down in the face of difficulties and breaks down because of one problem, then how did he live before that? It's his life after all. Everything that happens in it is up to him. His body began to be covered in a strange magical haze. Such as he was, breaking him was possible. He would have long ago ceased to be an adventurer, a surprised look on his face. His dark armor inspiring terror and the haze from the grenade. It was beginning to dissipate. The knight started to approach him, but the guy gripped his dagger tighter and prepared to finally slay this boss. He had no other choice. The knight wheezed and came closer and closer to him with each step, staring with the dark chinks of his armor right at the boy. With each movement, he began to move at some incredible speed, but it still wasn't enough for him. It was slow. The knight didn't understand anything. He was only trying to keep up with the guy who was moving faster and faster. The boss couldn't keep up with him anymore. Fury glistened on the protagonist's face. He didn't plan to give up just like that. When he cast the smoke bomb and the nameless knight, he undertook two things before using the dungeon move. First, he restored his HP from 985 to 1985 points. He drank a health potion to conceal the knight and prevent him from seeing what he was doing. 2, he improved his skill. Now he had to counterattack. The boy grasped his small dagger and, concentrating his strength in it, ran straight into the knight's back. He held on to the handle of his weapon, which had become a loyal friend over a long period of time, and had never failed him in difficult situations. The boy screamed with rage. Now he would not back down a step. He so seems to himself that he can do without a command. The dagger, having accumulated the power of magic, was still able to pierce through the knight's armor. A metallic cracking sound was heard. The guy was pressing the blade with all his might to keep the knight's wits about him. That wasn't all. The blade was sticking out of the knight's back. He took out a large club from his inventory that he had taken from one of the orcs and began to bash it into the knight's back to finally bring him down. He struck again and again, fury blazing in his eyes, and it was as if his strength never waned. Suddenly something happened that made him wary. The knight turned back with great speed. His attacks are pretty predictable now. He's not coming back from that. The knight swung his sword, and the guy let go a huge club right on his arm. There was a crunch and crack. In all directions splashed drops of blood. The arm flew off as well as then. The eyes of the knight shone with a bright light, and he screamed in pain. "What's this? I had to end it." The guy frowned and prepared to deliver a decisive blow. The knight wheezed in pain. He had never faced such opponents before. The sword slipped out of his hands, immediately reached out his hand to grasp it. It was a powerful weapon that could be used to overpower this knight. The sword went straight into the hands of the protagonist, and he felt a pleasant heaviness. He swung as hard as he could to slay this boss after all. The boy from the chiseled clique, and prepared to exterminate this spawn of hell. They looked at each other with eyes full of rage. The knight wheezed and lunged at him in a final rush. The boy lowered the heavy sword, and the knight split in two. He chopped the dungeon boss in one blow. The haze cleared, and an interesting picture appeared before the guy. The knight had split into two parts, and now slowly began to lean backwards. The main character still continued to hold a heavy sword in his hands and breathing loudly. He was trying to bring himself to his senses after such a fight. After, he began to smile, his heart beating with great frequency. The knight's severed body lay somewhere nearby, and a foul odor emanated from it. This monster was definitely a strong opponent, one of the strongest he'd ever had to fight before, the nameless knight. A disembodied voice reported that the protagonist's level has been raised by 52 units. Level increased another 30 units, completed boss crush. Title Nameless M. Is it really level 82 and that's it? The guy was surprised, but still he took the sword and began to scrutinize it. Well, okay. The best reward is the sword. He applied an appraisal spell to find out the true value and worth of the sword. It was the sword of a nameless knight. The recommended level is 1. Attack power plus 1.100. If the level of the enemy or human or monster is higher than the level of the wielder, its parameters are increased by 20%. Everything except XP and MP. The boy scrutinized the new item. The sword is called the Ball of the Nameless Knight. An original name, but still it would be a good replacement for his blade. Besides, his dagger was already completely broken. He bent over the wreckage of his dagger and silently thanked his opponent for now possessing such a powerful weapon. The guy stood up and sighed heavily. Now he had a new title, but he had no idea what to do with it. Suddenly a plaque appeared in front of him with information and Nameless Swordsman. Title bestowed on those who overcame all the difficulties alone, passing and only by their own strength and sword increasing level characteristics of the ball will increase accordingly. If his master Titov will be skills that improve ball skills, the title effect will not work. The implication is that this title improves the weapon's performance along with the level increase. A plaque of information. System. Do I think the titles are a bit too generic? Either way, he's grateful for it now. His strength will increase and further pumping will become much easier. It was already time for him to go back upstairs. But unfortunately, because of all the attacks, the Nameless Knight's magic stone was destroyed, so it didn't go to the protagonist. Well, he was moving towards the exit of the dungeon just like that. His long day in the Kenspei dungeon was over. It was time to move home. His stats had increased a lot during this time, which couldn't be helped. The day after defeating the Nameless Knight, he went to the store near the dungeon to buy a couple items. When he opened the doors, he saw a friendly girl who greeted him at the entrance with a smile. She greeted him and asked the guy to provide his adventurer card. He politely handed the girl his card and she began to study it. It was a gun store, but only those who were skilled adventurers could buy or sell anything here. Although right now he didn't get the Nameless Knight's sword. Here he was for a different reason. He remembered the treks he had taken already with his new weapons. The time he had fought one of the orcs on the 15th floor. He thought about it. With this weapon, he takes more damage from attacks. That's bad, so he needs a good defense. Although his attack power is increasing, he is slowing down with this sword. Before this, he was emphasizing his agility and speed. This weapon doesn't suit him at all. Besides, I'm more comfortable with my old dagger. Well, I guess I'll just have to change weapons. So far, he's more inclined to his dagger than his ball. Need to go back and buy it. That's how he ended up in the armory. The girl looked at him and realized that he was an adventurer of D rank. She pointed to the side and said that they had equipment for adventurers of that rank. Speaking of which, he's still rank D. He's already cleared a rank C dungeon, so technically he's already at rank C. All that's left to do is apply and he'll actually become one. If he told her that, the girl should show him the gear of his level. They had just stopped outside the department. The girl pointed him to a shelf of weapons. Besides, he could prove it to her since he was recently done with the dungeon. A guy with a weapon for C-rank adventurers and said it's okay. He needs to come here. The girl looked at him in surprise. She didn't understand what he was saying. She looked at him with a surprised look, but that wasn't the right rank for him. The boy didn't seem to mind her at all and stood by the weapons rack picking out a dagger. He doesn't need one of those. Finally, the boy stopped his gaze on one of the daggers. Pointing his finger at it, he asked the saleswoman, "Can I see it up close?" The girl hesitated. She still took out a dagger from behind the glass and held it out to the guys with a surprised look. No special skills, of course, but this dagger was pretty good. In shape and weight, it's similar to his old dagger. You don't have any level restrictions. The girl kept looking at him with a surprised look. She didn't understand anything. He said he was taking this dagger. The saleswoman looked at him with surprised wide eyes, because of the gibberish, that it is not necessary to make such hasty conclusions. Let him think about it. The dagger is good, but it is very expensive. In addition, adventurer with his rank, with it will not be easy. The guy smiled and put his new dagger away in his inventory, saying there was no problem with that. He is fully aware of the value of this item. As far as money is concerned, there will be no problem with that either. He handed the girl a large wad of money and said that as she could see, he could pay the whole amount at once. The saleswoman looked alternately at the money and at the boy. She didn't understand anything. Where did he get so much money? And why was he taking a weapon that didn't fit his rank? But still, the girl sold him this sword and in a timid voice thanked him for his purchase. The boy left the store and finally went about his business. After that, he returned to the familiar dungeon, and again it took him over and over again. The kinshal was in his hand like his own, and he swung it around, slashing monsters one by one. He rejoiced now with his level weapon. It was much more familiar and easier to deal with monsters. The dead boar was already lying next to him. This time the victory was very easy for him. And the boar was a lot weaker, but he still wants to take it with him. Well, it's time to upgrade your inventory to level 2. That should increase its carrying capacity. He tried his best to shove the huge boar carcass into his inventory. After all, he had to pay back the money for the dagger. But the boar didn't want to fit in. The guy had already lost all hope. Soon, he found himself on the 30th floor of the dungeon. Once again, he stood in front of the huge, massive doors leading to the boss room. Now, victory should be much easier than last time. His second battle had come. This boss had left behind an unpleasant impression, and memories of how he had almost said goodbye to his life last time came flooding back at him. A chill ran down the wall. This time, he'll bring his nameless sword with him. It'll work well against this knight, plus it'll be easier with the title effects. The sword will improve his stats. In the case of bosses that are higher than him in level and strength, this item will become indispensable in battle. All right. Okay, now it's time to get started. The boy opened the familiar door and with a quick, confident stride, he stepped inside the room. He was mentally and physically ready for the boss. He grinned and pointed his sword straight at the boss. It was a huge Kabank still holding the same huge club. Now, with his new sword, he would pose no danger to the protagonist. Yesterday, he was dodging his attacks barely, but today a whole different conversation. Right now, he was already attacking this boss head-on. He shouted with rage and swung his sword. There was a scraping sound of metal, and the sword struck the hard wooden club of the boss. Strangely, this monster was able to repel the blow. The guy didn't understand anything. How this monster managed to repel his attack. He swung again, the monster. The boss squealed in pain, and a huge sword crack began to spread across his chest. Blood started pouring out in all directions. Well, how much more could he take? The battle was surprisingly short. This boss surrendered almost immediately. An invisible voice rang out, which reported that the protagonist defeated the dungeon boss, and the amount of experience gained is increased by 2 units. His dungeon capture level was increased to 20. The guy sighed with some annoyance, just as he thought there would be no extra boss. It was strange, though. It was even a bit frustrating. He was so eager to use his new sword against this boss. But either way, it was going just fine. I wonder how much better this sword had gotten. The guy took hold of it and used the appraisal spell to find out how valuable the sword had become. He looked at his weapon carefully. Well, the attack power increased that's great. We need to collect the magic stones that fell out of the boss. After he finished gathering resources, the guy approached the return area, and a magical vortex began to swirl around him, bringing him back to the beginning of the dungeon. Looking at his watch, the guy realized that it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He felt invigorated so he could walk through the dungeon one more time. If he speeds up using teleport, he could clear this dungeon in 4 more 6 times. He had to make sure no one was following him. Looking around, the guy realized that there didn't seem to be anyone around. He could teleport without fear of being detected. He concentrated magic energy, and the vortex began to form around him again. There aren't many people in the dungeon. Therefore, it's easy to teleport. There is no fear of being discovered here. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out to him. The boy was surprised and shifted his eyes to the side. Was someone he knew here? It was Kurosaki, the girl, coming right out from around the nearest corner. She had a sword in her hands, and she was all alert. The boy looked at her with a frightened look. The girl looked at him with a serious look. A look like that would have made anyone a little afraid. The main character didn't understand what she was doing here. He sighed heavily and looked at the girl with a frightened and surprised look. There was no time for him anyway. Rin walked up to her and said that he hadn't expected to see her here. He tried to act as casually as possible so as not to arouse suspicion. The boy came a little closer and said that they had met quite quickly. The girl looked at him with a serious look, and with a nod of her head replied that they had just seen each other yesterday. Rin wondered if she wasn't with Kaz and the others today. Why is she alone in this dungeon? The girl nodded and replied that she didn't want to be chaperoned like this forever. Well, it all makes sense now she's level. Even a level 600 dungeon is hard to get through. She's probably fighting small monsters to increase her level. Anyway, mopping up the dungeon, he should consider his familiar walking around here. The boy turned to her and looked at her with a serious look. By the clock in the back of his head, he wondered. He should watch out for her on the next circle. It would raise suspicion if he met her again. He tried to act as natural as possible, but it looked even stranger from the outside. The protagonist said that it must have been quite some time, and he would have to move on. He waved goodbye to the girl, and already wanted to move in the opposite direction on his business. But suddenly the girl gripped his arm hard. The boy turned around and looked at her with surprise out of fear. What was she up to? They stood like that for a few more seconds, looking at each other with uncomprehending looks. Rin looked at her and waited for something scary to happen. Why was she clinging to him? The girl looked at him with serious big eyes. Suddenly she started to talk. She said, "This is a great opportunity next." Well, there was no choice. And now they walked together deep into the dungeon. The silence and darkness was cut only by the sound of their footsteps. Each of them was at the ready. The girl looked at him from the side, and the protagonist tried not to avert his gaze and only look straight ahead. He was really worried about not being exposed. He should have acted as natural as possible, but instead he was doing even worse. They continued to march forward as if in formation. In all this time, they had not spoken a word to each other. It was as if they did not know each other at all, but were mere passers-by. Finally, the boy dared to break the silence after all. He turned to her. He asked if he could find out her age and current status. The girl was silent and her gaze he on. It was obvious that this question displeased her. "So I just usually ask it on a blind date." The guy finally realized what a mistake he'd made and blushed. After a little thought, the girl answered. She said that she was 17 years old and what she was doing was a closely guarded secret. Having said that, she put her index finger to her lips to show you that it is better for no one to know about it. The guy answered that he was 19 years old, that he was doing, and here he got a little busy. He didn't know what to say. He had to remember that you can't give away all the secrets about yourself. And besides, he wasn't doing anything that special. Except for the dungeon sweep, the guy spends the most time with his sister. But if he answers like that, it's like he has a sister complex. However, when he was a student, he had a crush on the guy even more. He replied that he likes to read manga, play games, and so on, although he's been very busy lately, so he doesn't have any free time. Hearing that, the girl blushed and stared at him even harder. Stammering, she replied that she was clear. The girl seemed embarrassed by this answer. The guy wondered, was she surprised by something? Looking at her, it's unclear what she's thinking about. Still, having come to his senses for a moment, the girl began to speak. By the way, the girl wanted to ask him something else, such as who he wanted to work, but did not have time to finish his sentence, because the guy worriedly said that the monsters were approaching, and they had to go. She looked in his direction, offended. The guy noticed it and apologized for interrupting her. He asked her again, was she saying something? The girl hummed to herself, out of poorly concealed resentment, saying it was no big deal. They needed to get going. She moved forward with a quick step, not even waiting for her companion. The boy only stared at her. A massive black figure with burning eyes peeked out from around the corner. Soon a host of orcs came out to meet the friends, not grunting and clanking their sharp teeth. These creatures were intent on devouring the hapless travelers. The boy gripped his sword tighter and said he would take those and the two on the left. The girl in turn said that she would then take the ones on the right. He moved with great speed right into the thick of things. He jumped on several orcs at once, swung his sword over them, and prepared to slash them to death. He struck a few blows at the creatures, but the effect was nil. They were still standing, holding their clubs and axes. It was amazing. Had the skin of these creatures become tougher than usual? The orcs were making shrill grunting sounds and were already preparing to attack their prey. But the protagonist didn't seem to be deterred in the slightest. He put his sword out to defend himself and began to maneuver deftly around the creatures pouncing on him. In one motion, he blocked the powerful blow of the axe. When he felt the force and the impact that reverberated through every muscle in his body, his eyes widened in surprise. The boy sighed heavily. This axe was incredibly heavy, heavier than the time he came here. With a great effort, he repelled the attack and swung his axe, dropping it to the ground. The axe hit the ground with a loud thud, and in its place was a small hole with cracks spreading in different directions across the floor. Strange, that was definitely beyond the strength of a normal orc. The kid looked at it carefully, if not furtively. This blow was clearly stronger. No wonder this orc was level 600 now. His attacks were even stronger and heavier. And they were even harder to dodge. The guy wondered, but why all of a sudden did this thing have level 600? What changed? For a second, fear flashed across his face. Now it would be much harder for him to deal with this thing. Don't underestimate them. He should not hold back and use all his strength to defeat this monster. If that's the case, he has no choice. He swung his dagger again and attacked the beast. The guy ran straight for the pig-like spaces. It was impossible to delay now and to concentrate fully only on the fight. There was a glint of rage on his face. He gathered all his will and strength into a fist. It would be necessary to deal with this thing at all costs. The boy ran at him and thrust his blade forward. After a few seconds, he came close to the orc, and with all his might, he thrust the sharp blade of his blade straight into its thick hide. This time, he managed to break through the defense, and the sharp blade entered the flesh of the beast. The orc wheezed, letting out a death groan. But at that time, another dungeon dweller was already approaching him from behind. He raised his axe and prepared to swat the kid. At the last moment, the protagonist noticed it. Turning around, he struck the orc's throat with all his might with his blade. Blood splattered in different directions, and the head began to slowly separate from the body. In a split second, the monster was defeated. The boy stood in front of the beast's decapitated body. Yesterday's pumping had done nothing but good. He had become much stronger and faster. Now his quick reaction time had saved his life. The guy was already done with his part of the monster and wondered how his girlfriend was doing. At this time, the girl fiercely fought the oncoming hordes of orcs. Swinging her sword several times with great speed, she activated an air spell and ordered the wind to shred those monsters. The orc stood a short distance away from the girl, but suddenly her sword seemed to lengthen and became several times larger. Guy watched from the side and looked at her in surprise. These things are 5 meters away from her. Will she be able to reach them with her attack? But it wasn't that simple. As soon as the girl applied the spell, a squall wind appeared out of nowhere and flew straight at the monster, and in one fell swoop chopped off their ugly pig heads. The guy couldn't believe his eyes. What kind of magic is this? The blades lengthened. The girl swung her sword one last time and looked at the guy with a calm gaze. She exhaled lightly and said that she was done as well. From this angle, she looked even more formidable. The protagonist looked at her sword with admiration. No, it can't be. Maybe this sword. The protagonist began to guess something. Apparently noticing his confusion, the girl nodded her head. It was right. Ray put her weapon forward and seriously said that her magic sword, it's her special skill. She can create swords with special properties. The girl swung the sword and it began to dissolve into the air as if nothing had happened. This one was created in the likeness of the wind. It can lengthen at will to summon you, which is quite convenient. The guy scratched the back of his head. It turns out it was very convenient, so she can create any sword. Ray nodded her head. However, there's a limitation because of the level and the amount of MP she can use. The guy couldn't stop admiring her. Even still, her skill is simply admirable. Hearing this, the girl blushed with embarrassment. She sighed heavily and silently thanked him for the compliment. Puzzled, she said the guy was also an incredible man. He didn't understand what he was talking about after all. He had perfectly ordinary skills after all. The girl continued. Her guild commander said that this guy was very weak, however, that wasn't the case at all. She can't even explain his fighting style. The protagonist scratched the back of his head and looked at the girl in surprise. He hesitated, but thanked her. He didn't know where this was going. Sign heard an unintelligible sound from somewhere. The girl leaned over to him and asked if he had any guesses. He nodded his head and said he wanted to be sure. There were no earthquakes in the dungeon. The guy doesn't think that's it. But if it is, they're in big trouble now. By that word, he meant the night after all. Anyway, the main character says she's going to go look around. What's she gonna do? If she doesn't want to, she can go back. The guy doesn't mind. The girl shook her head negatively and said she would go along with him. Eventually, once they began to investigate the 5th floor, they discovered the cause of the strange sounds. Far away from them, there were several strange creatures. They could see familiar silhouettes after all. They were orcs, eating boars they had killed themselves. But it wasn't just boars, it was orcs. So they were also cannibals. Seeing this gruesome and ghastly sight, the girl covered her mouth with her hand. That's right, they're devouring each other. The boys themselves were disgusted at the sight of it all. Usually after a kill, all corpses are consumed with the dungeon itself. However, sometimes still some monsters with magic stones remain. Seems to be a new discovery. They get stronger by eating others. Most likely the orcs they encountered earlier came from here. So if they killed them all, it would stop? Hope flashed in the girl's voice. The boy nodded his head in the affirmative. It was like that. It was better to stop them at once, rather than have someone get hurt. The girl swung her sword, and it immediately began to lengthen. Not even a second later, a powerful burst of wind cut off the heads of all the orcs at once at the same time. They didn't even have time before they died. The girl looked at the protagonist and asked, "Will he help?" He hesitated and said, "Yes, of course, it will be even more effective," but he wanted to say it, but the girl beat him to it. "Well, it's about time. And get these corpse eaters over with." Several of the creatures looked at the protagonists with their fierce gazes and held tightly to their hammers. The boys jumped up on the spot and rushed right into the thick of it. There was the sound of metal and tearing flesh. Orcs fell one by one now. These creatures posed no threat. The boys could easily take them out with a single blow. Soon it was over. Rin said he had found a magic stone. Well, they burned all the orcs with the sword of flame. Now all this has to stop. He thanked Ray for her help. The girl shook her head. Without the knowledge of the main character, she wouldn't be able to do this. They did it together. A little embarrassed, the girl said she had a question for the boy. He looked at her in surprise, goosebumps running down his spine again. After hesitating for a while, the girl asked him why he had decided to become an Adventurer 7. Rin hesitated, the question putting him in a bit of a stalemate. He had to gather his thoughts and answer as evasively as possible. He never told anyone but his sister, always tried to keep it a secret. After gathering his thoughts a little, he began to speak. Once upon a time, an adventurer unexpectedly saved his life. Listened attentively to the story of his new friend. The guy kept talking. He could see only his back, but his strength looked incredible. That's why he decided to become like this man, so he could defend himself now. The girl lowered her eyes, so she knew. That's why she wanted to be together with him. The boy didn't hear or heard, but didn't understand. Either way, he asked her again, concern on his face. The girl stepped back and said it was no big deal. More importantly, did the guy know who the adventurer was? He replied that he couldn't recognize him by name. The situation wasn't easy. However, even so, he was sure that this person was among the top best adventurers in the world. The girl looked at him with a joyful look and thanked him again. She was very happy that the guy shared such a deep secret with her. He scratched the back of his head. I was trying to figure out what was going on. He was pleased to hear it himself, but still the situation was strange. He asked Ray, what is she going to do next? Would she continue to take over the dungeon? The girl nodded her head. Yes, she would go on. The guy thought for a second. He always fights in dungeons alone. But this time something was different. Sometimes he still enjoys going through a dungeon in a group. At least it's more fun. Trust gives them strength. They moved on together. They encountered more and more monsters on their way. But thanks to the fact that they were together, it was now much easier to deal with the monsters. Because each of them could count on support. After another day, he began to raise the level with even greater speed, teleporting to the dungeon, and killing only red boars, for which gave the most experience. In the end, he conquered the dungeon 20 times, raised 400 levels and earned 4 million. He pumped his inventory to level 4, still not enough room. He couldn't carry all the items he needed. Not a good time to be in a dungeon. He just needed to put a high-grade orc stone in his inventory. The next day, needless to say, he started leveling up again. He went back and forth in the dungeon and killed the same bosses over and over again, raising his level to the highest possible level. Along with this time, he had already cleared the dungeon 23 times. He stood in front of the dungeon boss, who already seemed very familiar to him. The huge orc swung at him, but the guy put up his fist and easily deflected the attack with one hand. It was the kind of monster that looked at him with surprise. The first time he had seen an opponent of this level. In the monster's eyes, and he had already resigned himself to his unenviable fate. The guy swiped once with his blade, and the space around him seemed to distort as if it had been distorted. The blow was of incredible power. With just that one hit, the monster's body crumbled like a piece of wood. The guy didn't spend any effort at all to defeat this boss. Level up signs started appearing from everywhere. Reward for capturing the dungeon. Level up by he had captured this dungeon as many times as possible. It was some kind of new plaque. Level 50 bonus reward. Level increased by, in the future capture of this dungeon. He will no longer receive any rewards. Great, he was able to complete this dungeon in its entirety. A whole 60 captures. First, you need to increase your strength and speed. They have a maximum level of A table with his skills and statistics reappeared in front of the guy. To everything else, it is worth pumping out the search for enemies, stealth and resistance to negative effects. There is still 610 SP. Well, that'll do. Everything was ready. The boy joyfully balled his hand into a fist. Great. He had become much stronger than the self he was a couple minutes ago. Well, I had to get to the point. For further advancement, the Tangi Dungeon and Arakawa would come in handy. He's been clearing them since he first became an adventurer. After 3 days, the guy was still pumping his skills up to the maximum possible level. He was slashing the monster hordes with his dagger. And now, they posed no danger to him. Maximum number of times possible. Now he wouldn't be able to get any rewards here either. He had successfully completed the conquest of Tangi Dungeon. This is the 4th dungeon conquest. Now the SP must be distributed. He sat on his bed and scrutinized the plaques of information. It was already late at night, but he was still awake. Suddenly a message arrived on his phone. The next day the weather was beautiful. From where you heard familiar frightened cries. It was Yui. She was shyly looking straight at the main character. Apparently the girl was late for something. She apologized profusely. She was terribly embarrassed. She asked the guy, how long did he wait for her? Rin briefly answered yes. The girl was horrified. Aren't guys supposed to talk back at times like this? And this wasn't how she had envisioned herself at all. The main character was a little confused, wasn't he? He always tells it straight. The girl tried to guffaw. She thanked him for coming today. She invited him to go to the cafe with her. Well, today the guy ordered himself a tea with milk because last time black coffee was bitter. The girl ordered herself something nice. I don't even know what it is. Rin asked her. So what did she want to talk about after all? About the dungeon? The girl briefly answered yes. Well, it was just as he thought. The girl said that she had recently been invited to join the guild. Hearing this, the protagonist was greatly surprised. After all, it was wonderful. Usually in guilds, here are 12 to 100 people. The top guilds have a lot of power and privileges, so guilds are always looking for newcomers, especially talented people. By the way, did the guy ask her how much she had increased her level in the last few days? The girl smiled and happily replied that she had surpassed the 100 mark in the past few days. Hearing this, the protagonist was very much surprised. Surpassed the 100th level. Amazing. This girl is stronger and more persistent than he thought at first glance. He asked her, what is the name of this guild? The girl hesitated and replied that it seemed to be Evening Moon. She took out a small business card from her pocket, which had a picture of a crescent moon along with a sword on it. It's like the kid remembered something. He felt like it was one of the best guilds in Japan. The girl nodded. They claimed, what is a small elite guild? To her, they're with a lot of potential. The main character has heard a lot that good hitters are in short supply everywhere. It's true, potions cost a decent amount of money. That's why hitmen are very valued in teams. After all, it is the main support link. So she wanted to ask him whether to join or not. The friend was embarrassed. It was right, she wanted his opinion. Rin Yi said that he didn't know that much about the guild himself. Was she definitely okay with it? His advice might not be the same. The girl leaned towards him even more and said that she certainly doesn't mind. She wants to hear his opinion. He sighed heavily. So first, he would like to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the guild. First of all, the advantage. It's the support from their side. She will be provided with equipment, as well as strategies for traversing many popular dungeons. In addition, the guild will gather a group for her that is compatible with her, that is highly compatible. This is a very important point of being in the guild. It eliminates the risk of being abandoned. The girl apparently remembered the moment when she was abandoned. She remembered the people who had done such a mean thing to her, and sadness reappeared on her face. The downside was the restriction of freedom. The girl didn't understand what kind of restraint. The guild is planning sweeps, so we'll have to stick to the schedule. Same with the group. They usually plan when they're going to go to the dungeon. The only problem is the request from the Dungeon Association. The girl's a girl. She's been told something like this before. When there are problems with dungeons, guilds are ordered to deal with them. If there are any force majeure situations, the request can still be rejected, but guilds usually obey. Therefore, guild members have to go to some pretty dangerous places. Oh well, it was necessary to summarize the results. If she wanted to become stronger as quickly as possible, then she should join this guild as well. But if she wants safety, she doesn't have to join. No one is forcing her to join. Still, why did she decide to become an adventurer? He's rather curious. The girl wondered why she decided to become an adventurer. Actually, there was one reason. She pondered, as if trying to find the right words. Shivering, and her thoughts are muddled. Actually, the only reason she qualified as an adventurer was to invite friends. It's all just to increase your characteristics. Then I'll make you stronger. A handful of people risking their lives to become stronger, the girl continued. She said that she had managed to gain power, and when she found out that she was a chiller, she decided to support the adventurers from the rear. So she continued her career as an adventurer, thinking it was a useful endeavor. In short, she just wanted to be useful. The girl looked at her hands, and the look made you a little sad. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but she has this talent, so it can help considerably. Well, so she's made up her mind. The protagonist was smiling at her. At last, the girl had finally realized what she wanted. Yes, she'll have the courage to join the guild. Rin smiled and said that if it was going to be difficult, then yes, let her just leave them. Her life is the most important thing. Also, let her beware of slave exploitation. Yui smiled back at him and told him that it wouldn't be a problem. Besides, she's still a high school student, so she'll only be able to go to the dungeon on weekends. And as for money, her earnings are increasing since chileras get decent money. She will probably be able to overtake the protagonist as well. He looked at her ironically and said he would look forward to it. He was able to make over 10 million in 3 days. He wondered if she would be able to handle it. He would say it now, but it was best to refrain. The guy headed for the exit. It was already time for him to leave. The girl sniped at him and told him to wait. She would pay herself. The boy winked at her and told her to let Tanya worry. He knows she won't get any money from the guild now. After all, she has to work it off first, right? If of course she insists, she can pay. However, he will pay today. The girl blushed again and looked at the protagonist with her big eyes in which tears began to glisten. She was incredibly grateful to him. At the same time, she didn't understand why she deserved such a good attitude to herself. She said that the main character was very considerate and kind and reliable. The guy smiled smugly and thought to himself that finally someone realized how good he was. But there was still one, but she was confused and asked why in that case he had never had a girlfriend. And that question put him even more in a stupor. Wait a minute, what did she just say? How does she know all this? What is she, a stalker or something? She waved her hands and tried to justify herself. No, it's not like that. Hannah told her about it. And why even mention it? The boy didn't understand. It was starting to irritate him. They were walking down the street and looking thoughtfully in different directions. The boy was a little out of sorts after the last conversation. They went to the window and suddenly saw a familiar girl. It was Kurosaki. She was sitting with headphones on and listening to music. She didn't seem to pay any attention to the strangers. But then she saw them coming toward her from the side. Her eyes were as serious as ever. Seeing the protagonist, she was surprised. What is he doing here? The guy shyly said hello and told her that it had been almost a week since they last met. Yui was worried. How? Why? Why did she respond to Rin when she was the one who called the girl? It must have really hurt her and upset her. She felt like the girl just ignored her. Kurosaki turned to her and coldly asked her who she even was. The girl didn't seem to realize who she was at all. Yui got angry and surprised even more. Didn't she recognize her? They were in the same class. Ray wondered. She thought she'd seen this girl somewhere. The guy was looking at the whole thing from the side. He didn't even realize that these two were in the same school. What a strange coincidence. Yui turned to the main character and asked how he knew Kurosaki. The guy replied that she was also an adventurer. The other day, they met in the dungeon. The girl was surprised. She hadn't even realized it. Ray was picking out something on the shelf. On one of the discs, there was a cover with a brightly colored girl who Hayu waved at every customer. The guy was embarrassed and tried to at least internally come up with an intelligible answer so as not to embarrass anyone. They're battle buddies. Yeah, battle buddies. That would be the best answer. At this time, Ray thought she was trying really hard to keep her hobby a secret, but she didn't even notice. Yui was watching all of this and didn't understand anything at all. Their behavior appeared to her at odd points. Smiling, the girl said it was nice to talk to her for the first time. Usually she wore headphones and she didn't have the courage to distract her. What was it called? That's right. The girl remembered. Aren't those anime songs with cute girls? She likes them, right? Hearing that, Ray became as gloomy as a cloud in a second. She choked on air and tried to hide her embarrassment, but it wasn't working very well, to say the least. Mentally, she begged her to stop and not give away all her secrets, as she would burn with shame now. This attack was too strong for her. The guy was watching all of this from the sidelines, and he was getting a little creepy himself. He finally decided to break the awkward long pause and asked the girl if she was going to go to the dungeon today. Ray came out of her stupor after all and nodded her head. Today she was going to go along with Kazami and the others. She would probably go straight from here. This place wasn't far. This wasn't. At this time, Yui was rummaging through a shelf of CDs, marveling at how many anime songs there were. Rin thought she didn't get the hint. She should have just sneaked off with him. They looked at each other eye to eye, and from the outside you would have thought they were some kind of lovers. Neither of them dared to make any sudden movements. The main character kept shaking with fear. He didn't know how to get out of here anymore. I guess he'll go. He forgot that he cleared one dungeon yesterday, so today is a day off. He exhaled heavily. It was dangerous. Almost suggesting she go points, the girl continued to silently stare at him with a serious look. At this moment, the guy seemed the strangest to her. Apparently noticing her cold stare, he turned to the girl. Did she realize something? The girl gurgled to herself under her breath, meaning to go out with a girl on her day off. You could hear the disappointment in her voice. In other words, is he in a relationship? She looked at him with a serious look with a raised eyebrow. At this time, the guy's whole life flashed before his eyes. He didn't know what to say. Rin started waving his arms and taking her out that it's not like that. He only came to counsel Yui. He's just the only adventurer she knows. Ray couldn't hear him anymore. She asked, does he like a younger girl? Rin was ready to fall under the ground, such a question he obviously didn't expect. How did it come to this? Oh man, another tough question. He has a feeling that a like or dislike answer will only cause confusion. However, as a man, he should answer honestly. He gathered all his will in his fist, and as earnestly as possible told us that if he had to choose between like or dislike, he would choose like. When she heard that answer, the girl was embarrassed and looked away. So she did like it. She blushed as if she was very embarrassed by the answer. The devil. He made the wrong choice, but he doesn't regret it. Yui heard their conversation and cut in. She asked with interest, so what are they talking about now? Suddenly a strange sound came from somewhere, and the walls of the store shook. What was that? Earthquakes? The loudspeaker began to announce the emergency in a loud voice. Everyone needed to go to shelter. Rupor reported that there has been an outburst in the Kenzuki dungeon. All citizens should evacuate immediately. Adventurers of rank C and above should cooperate with them. The guy exhaled heavily. Surges in the dungeon. This was the first time he'd heard of it. The girls began to worry and talk among themselves. What could be happening out there? There was fear in each of the boys' eyes. They had never faced this before in their lives. Dungeon splash, this is a very rare an occurrence. A gate that usually only adventurers pass through, opened by a monster that dwells in the dungeon. The city, it will be overrun with monsters. The protagonist's eyes flashed back to the images from his childhood, which he tried so hard to forget. Dungeon surge? This is a very rare occurrence. A gate that normally only adventurers pass through can be opened by a monster that dwells in the dungeon. The protagonist turned to Ray and said that he was going to go fight monsters. And what was she going to do? The girl confidently replied that of course she would go along with him. Yui gave her thin voice. She asked them to wait. She wanted to go along with them, too. Her voice was friendly but brimming with determination. The girl wasn't going to back down. Everyone was surprised and looked at the little girl. Did she want to go help them fight monsters, too? The guy leaned over to her and said in a serious voice that at least level 500 was required to clear this dungeon. The girl sighed and said that she wasn't planning on fighting monsters. She just wants to heal the wounded with her magic, but if she gets in their way, then they can leave her alone. There was sadness and sorrow on her face. The guy thought about it. It was true that civilians without a status window couldn't use healing greens. However, there would be a proc from healing magic. There was a logic to it. To increase this power that can save people. He remembered the girl's words that she had told him when they were sitting in the cafe. He nodded his head, okay, fine, but let her stay with him. The girl looked at him in surprise. She didn't expect the protagonist to approve of her plan. She smiled. Her cheeks flushed again, nodded her head in agreement, and thanked the guy for letting her participate. Well, now he had to move towards the dungeon as quickly as possible to save as many innocent people as possible. They better get their equipment while there's still time. Indeed, without it, it would be more difficult to fight the monsters. They quickly went to get their equipment and weapons. Soon they were already dressed in their usual uniforms that they wear in the dungeon. They felt much more confident in it. How cool. A quick change of clothes with inventory. Yui looked at them with astonishment and felt a bit deprived at this moment. After all, she hadn't gotten the inventory skill yet. The guy smiled, even a little funny, as if she wasn't in their group. The girl took offense and said that she didn't expect such a thing from him. Still, she wouldn't lose his spirit since that was the case. Then she would forgive him. After all, the guy had allowed her to fight after all. At this moment, the girl looked incredibly cute. Suddenly, Reisa's phone rang. She was embarrassed and apologized, saying she needed to answer it. The guy nodded her agreement. Suddenly, the phone stopped vibrating and the girl lowered her gaze. In a sad voice, she said that her guild leader had called. He asked for help in this raid. The guy nodded. All was well. She apologized to her friends, but still she had to go. Rin said it was no big deal, then they would go too. He said goodbye so the girl wouldn't overdo it. She just nodded and told him to take care of himself. The girl turned around and walked in the opposite direction with a serious look. She ran down the street, heels clicking on the paving stones. Panic was setting in everywhere. Apparently all the people here had felt the tremor. The boy agonized. Is this a sense of danger? No, he's just screwing with himself. Yui heard that and shifted her worried gaze to him. She was worried about the kid as she could see that he was worrying too much by the look of him. He tried to tidy himself up and as earnestly as possible said that everything was all right. We had to move out. The girl nodded and they went to the scene together. The friends ran quickly down the smooth central road. From somewhere they could already hear cries for help, but they didn't make it just in time for the last moment. The monsters from the dungeon had already broken free, and now, several shape-shifting orcs surrounded the men. One of the knights was already standing there, and tried to fight back. But the monster was too many. Yui pointed over there. The guy said he could see it perfectly. We had to act quickly or those things would start eating innocent people. Rin jumped up, and with great speed began to move right into the thick of those things. He had to protect the innocents, for the memories of his childhood still plagued him in his nightmares. The guy ran into the center of the cluster of these creatures and began to chop them with one hand. Orcs did not pose much danger to him, and he was able to deal with them with great ease. It was like an easy walk. The guy chopped off the heads of those pig-like creatures one after another, not for nothing after all. He had been practicing all this time. Now his strength had increased many times over. At this time, a few people were watching everything that was happening. They did not remember themselves from fear. But when they saw how one man easily dealt with these animals, they were even more frightened. They looked at the protagonist with surprised eyes wide with fear. The friends approached the victims and asked, "Are they all right?" The man in the armor stammered and said they were fine. Didn't they kill them all? It was so fast he didn't even notice. The guy smiled and said he was glad he was able to get there in time. Yui began to use her healing on the boy, and early on it immediately began to take hold. People watched in amazement. I couldn't believe my eyes. The wound healed in seconds. The injured people smiled, and thanked their friends for helping them so much. Guy observed all of this from the side. Although the girl is at a low level, but her healing skills are very good. Perhaps she had an innate talent for this skill after all. Well, in a few seconds, she'd finished treating the injured victims. Now need to go to the dungeon. The girl looked at the protagonist with surprise. The guy thought, okay, I was originally like this, but even if they make it inside the dungeon, there's no guarantee that the situation there will be better than outside. The problem is that when the dungeon surges, the monsters become much stronger and more aggressive. There's a possibility that they won't be able to handle them now. It's said that it's because of the excess energy that the dungeon uses to maintain the state. There is nowhere to go now, so all the energy goes into the monsters. And now the monsters that dwell there are 1.5 to 2 times stronger. Bosses are also becoming incredibly strong. Sometimes their strength increases tenfold. They are often referred to as the final bosses. After defeating him, the dungeon surge will stop. The longer the surge continues, the stronger the boss becomes. If the dungeon finally collapses, this incredibly strong creature will be on the loose, and many people will be at risk of death. Therefore, it should be killed as soon as possible. Because of its power, you will need a squad a rank higher. The dungeon is C rank, so you need to find a group of B rank adventurers or a squad of players over 5,000 level. The main character would like to participate in this, but his level doesn't allow it. Still in effect, if he broke in there, the girl would probably guess that he could ignore those rules. Besides, he had already told Ray that he had taken over the dungeon yesterday. Even during the dungeon surge period, there are restrictions on entry. This time, they are responsible for exterminating the dungeon monsters. Everyone nodded their heads in agreement. It had to be done as quickly as possible to avoid innocent victims. On the lower dungeon level, several adventurers were already fighting the monsters that were trying to break free. They were using all possible spells to hold back the ever-growing power of these monsters. The people were breathing heavily. They had reached the room with the boss, much faster than expected. Now they were standing in front of the oak door, behind which they could already hear the terrifying sounds of the monster that was there. In about 30 minutes, a group from the nearest guild should arrive. The dungeon was in turmoil. People were worried and wanted to hide somewhere as quickly as possible. The danger was riding over them more and more every second. Therefore, Kazami took advantage of this and tried to enter the dungeon first at the expense of his glory. The manager tried to stop him because of his low level, but that person only promised to clear the way for the rank B group. Although it bothered him that he had ignored so many monsters on the path, it was now left to wait for the rest of the factions. After all, the monsters on the path were pretty good. The man sighed heavily, but still, he was able to deal with them. Smiling, the man said that he had a suggestion. Since things had turned out this way, why don't they kill the boss themselves? This suggestion was self-contradictory. Since their faction level was much lower, it could attract more danger to them. At such an offer, the girls were stunned. On their faces, what's he talking about? Shouldn't they wait for reinforcements? They can't do it on their own, can they? But he didn't think of stopping. There was a glint of determination in his eyes, and his voice was firm. He said that he had changed his mind. If the monsters were a little stronger, we would have done so. But things didn't turn out that way. Therefore, they should have the strength to destroy the boss. Isn't it time for them to spread their wings and make a name for themselves? He thinks it's the perfect chance to showcase himself and their team. But his friends didn't share his confidence. What's he talking about? Is this guy out of his mind? Ray looked at him with a surprised look. Is he really that crazy? Their primary goal is to keep the dungeon from collapsing. And him, now he's making some sumo-sbrodic decisions. Does he think their words are that important? But it looks like the others are tied at all, or there's no catch to it. They were completely on their leader's side. The girl said they shouldn't miss the chance to become famous. The others also agreed. They thought it was a good idea. Were they unworthy adventurers? Even if he was stronger, the tank would cover them with his steadfastness. Ray tried her best to talk some sense into them because this is just crazy. Are they really going to do this? That's not what they promised the manager. Well, the man was adamant. It won't matter if the boss is defeated. If she's afraid, she can stay here. They can handle the boss on their own. He said the last words with a kind of unspeakable contempt. The girl caught on to this and looked at him with a startled look. If they do this, they will be rewarded and honored, right? So there's no reason to refuse here. It was clear from the guy's words that he had no intention of backing down at all. But still, she thought this idea was just crazy. To these people, reducing the damage of the dungeon surge was a secondary goal. All they are interested in right now is their own glory and profit. Well, that was his final decision, and he wasn't going to change it. And most of the group agrees with him. He says if the girl doesn't want to, she can stay here. But he wondered if she could handle the remaining monsters behind her. Still, the girl broke down and agreed to go along with them. He smiled and said he thought so. Well, now it had to start. There was no turning back. The leader of the group stood in front as always. He opened the creaky wooden door and stepped inside. The boss was already waiting for them there. Everyone was alert, preparing their magic power in case of an unexpected attack. They finally went inside. Something had changed in there, as if the atmosphere itself had gotten heavier. Ray looked around. There was something she didn't like about this place. It wasn't like before. There was a strange aura of terror in the air. The realization finally dawned on her that they were no longer waiting for reinforcements. Now, that gate would only open when they were defeated or dead. Now, there was no other choice. The huge dungeon boss was already standing in front of them, and now, he looked much more intimidating. There was also an aura of power emanating from him that was even more powerful than the previous time. No wonder, because the dungeon rift had strengthened this monster just like it said. He looked like a killing machine. He was basically the point of it now. He had a huge, sharp axe in his hands. His fangs were even bigger, and his eyes were filled with fury. The monster made a wrenching sound and looked at his future victims. Now that's a surprise. He's certainly strong. The squad leader turned to his girlfriend and asked what she thought about it. The girl smiled and said that we should look at the level first. This is a supreme orc of the 3000th level. After the rest of the squad heard this, a look of fear ran across their faces. Now they finally realized what they were about to face. The boss exceeded their squad's level by almost 1,000, but it didn't seem to bother the guy at all. He clenched his fists and got ready. He had a gambling smile on his face. All right, heroes are those who overcome adversity. They just have to believe in themselves. The rest of the squad tried their best to fight their fears. They tried to convince themselves that they could still succeed. It was very difficult, as each of them realized that the boss was incredibly strong, and to defeat them they would have to do their best. And only one of them realized the hopelessness of their situation. She didn't expect that they could really handle him. It was already clear that the boss was incredibly strong. Their commander didn't think about safety at all, and just sent his companions to their deaths. The squad leader ordered his tank to cover them with his shield. He in turn applied a solid seal to prepare for the boss's strongest strike. The man was already fully confident of his victory. Putting out his hand, he looked at the monster. It was a pity that he couldn't show proper resistance. Well, it was time to finish this thing off. He had already started to apply his thunder spell, but no sooner had he done so than the huge pig-like monster let out a monstrous roar, and everything seemed to change. The air became even heavier, and no one knew what was happening. But something definite had changed. Something terrible was about to happen. Inside, everyone knew it, but no one wanted to show their concern. Ray came to a startled halt. What was this? She felt something strange. There was definitely something wrong here. Everything inside felt like it was shrinking. She could almost physically feel the full power of the monster. But their squad leader didn't seem to care at all. He was still staring at the monster arrogantly. Was this another desperate attempt? But it was already clear to everyone that this monster was going to die. Suddenly, he himself felt something. His expression changed in a second. Suddenly, a multitude of knights appeared beside the boss. Their armor glittered in the muted light. There were so many of them that my body shook, and more of them appeared with each passing second. He asked the Sakura what kind of guys were they. The girl replied that they were nameless knights. All 5 of them had level 2000. Well, okay. He wasn't allowed to show his concern. After all, these guys were enemies. He had never heard of a couple more monsters appearing with the boss. Still, he used his thunder spell. A powerful blow rang out, but there wasn't a single scratch on the knights' bodies. They continued to slowly approach, rattling their armor. They're pretty sturdy. The men noticed that. He ordered Yue and Kosuke to try to stop them. One of the knights swung his huge sword, and the blade passed just a few centimeters from the man's face. He could literally feel the lingering chill that came from that cold sword. Finally, the fear inside him woke up. These monsters are intelligent. They are attacking their rear. This was something he definitely didn't expect. Rei summoned her magic sword to at least try to contain the influx of these monsters. The knights were rather clever creatures. One of them made a diversion with his sword and swung his leg to strike his opponent with all his might. The man was furious. Gritting his teeth, he used a thunder spell with all his might to finally strike the bastard. There was an equally deafening ringing sound, lightning striking the armor. Thank God the girl made it. Did they see it? The knight fell dead. Indeed, one of them fell to the ground and lay motionless. The smoke from the explosion was coming from his body. Okay, there's 4 more to go. After a few minutes, there was only one knight left. It was necessary to deal with him as soon as possible, but the strength was almost running out. The boys were pretty exhausted, but we had to deal with him and finish off the Orc Supreme. But now something unexpected happened again, and everyone, without exception, felt it. Their faces were once again horrified. The commander didn't know what was going on. Nobody knew, but something bad was going on. We have to kill the High Orc and get out of here. Something told them that their lives might be cut short now. Sakura looked to the side, and what she saw made her pupils dilate and her insides go cold with terror. Her breathing spasmed, she couldn't think straight. She saw something terrible, something they wouldn't be able to stop. The boss's footsteps became much heavier, as if he weighed several thousand tons. The ground began to shake under the squad's feet. Each of them realized that now the end might come. They're too late. The dungeon has been destroyed. This was no joke now, they were all in mortal danger. They just stood there staring at the Orc King with their frightened eyes. At this time he was getting bigger and bigger by the second. Now he almost didn't fit in the boss room anymore. He was steaming, and his fangs had become even more terrifying. He had almost doubled in size, and now it was unclear how to escape from him. The girl realized that the irreversible had happened. The destruction of the dungeon had made this boss even stronger. It must have been collapsing while they were fighting the knights. Now their situation had become even more dire. The man asked Sakura, what level was the boss now? It was no longer the supreme orc. The girl's voice shook with fear. She just stood there in a daze watching as the huge monster approached her. This thing has evolved into an orc general, and its level is... The girl hesitated, her horror completely consuming her. Now this orc's level is 4, the truth was this. With his last strength, the squad leader tried to fight. Why couldn't he do anything? He used the thunder spell again, gathering all his strength into a fist. There was an explosion, but unfortunately the orc was not maimed. He still stood there looking at them with his lifelike eyes. The boy was ready to go insane with fear. He applied the spell time after time in an attempt to stop the monster somehow, but it just wasn't getting through the orc's body. The unique skills weren't working. Now they were powerless in the face of this monster. They wouldn't be able to defeat him no matter what they did. Rei couldn't believe it. The mood of this group was so fragile now. In the face of adversity, they looked like scared chickens. To become stronger, their opponents must be proportionally stronger than them. But this group only managed with their unique abilities, against small monsters. At this rate, it was simply impossible to improve their skills. However, now the group had lost their spirit, they had no cohesion. And this is the first and real fight. The girl was terrified. Now her life depended only on herself. It was useless to rely on the group. This fight had already begun. They would not be able to retreat, and apparently they would not be able to win. The orc looked at them with his bloodshot eyes. Now he wanted to tear these little people apart. They stood on the ground as if they had already accepted their fate. None of them. And so now they had no choice but to accept their deaths. The squad leader stood in front and watched with a devastated look as the monster swung its huge axe to strike him. He couldn't move from his seat in fear. Now his fate was sealed. Rei rushed towards him and shouted for him to move away immediately. Otherwise, the irreparable would happen now. The girl ran towards him, oblivious to the danger. Running up to her comrade, she shoved him aside with all her might to get out of the line of defense. But now she was setting herself up to be hit. Clearly, she couldn't dodge now. and the orc's huge axe went straight into her stomach. The blow was so powerful that her insides were now clumped together in a big lump. Her breathing almost stopped, and her heart stopped beating for a moment. She sighed heavily, as if with that sigh the last bit of her soul had gone out of her. Blood spurted from her mouth and her eyes widened to their fullest extent. The pain was unbearable, and it hit her like lightning, spreading throughout her body. The poor girl flew sideways and crashed into the wall with great speed. Tiles fell from the ceiling and began to fall to the floor. The exhausted girl just slumped to the floor with her lifeless body. Her eyes were closed. It seemed impossible to get up after such a blow. The last shards of consciousness were still present in her head. She tried to fight, and with all her might. The orc general roared a monstrous roar. What should we do? Everyone realized that they couldn't defeat this thing. There was no way out of the dungeon either. The dungeon boss swung his huge axe and prepared to destroy the people in front of him with one blow. The team just stood there and didn't even try to do anything. We had to stop him. But how? This place would become their mass grave, now they had no choice. But the squad leader suddenly came to his senses. He realized that if they couldn't get out of here, they had no other choice. He concentrated the last of his energy in one place and used a powerful thunderbolt. The orc, as if he didn't notice it, roared and already brought his huge sledgehammer over the squad's heads. He was waiting for blood, hungry for killing. A split second later, a tremendous explosion erupted. The axe finally reached its target, hitting the ground with a thud. The guy standing opposite was using his spell, trying his best to hold back the blow. But it was monstrous. Ray still trying to just come to her senses, she sat against the wall. With shards of consciousness, she was trying to figure out what was going on. Her eyes slowly opened, and she began to watch through news sing-songs at what was happening. But suddenly her body felt like it had been electrocuted. It just couldn't be. She saw something incredible. The orc stood whole and unharmed. He still held his huge axe in his hands. From this side, he looked like a huge living statue. He was breathing heavily, and smoke from the impact was coming from his body. 888 her team members were still alive, but their strength had almost left them, and now they just lay on the floor breathing heavily. Now the question was, when would they run out of HP? The orc noticed her. The girl went cold now. She was simply unable to fight. She had to protect herself somehow, or the monster would just destroy her with a single blow. It seemed that this orc was not taking any damage at all. The monster turned around, and with wide, rumbling steps headed towards the members of the squad lying on the ground. When it moved away, the girl saw that there was still one nameless knight left, standing somewhere in the corner, inactive for the moment. The girl barely had time to realize that there was one more knight left. He creaked his armor. Aya pushed his sword aside, a sign that he was about to attack. With heavy steps, he came close to her and held out his sword. The girl realized that she couldn't move. Would this be the end of it? She had already accepted her fate. There was nowhere to run. Now this knight would just finish her off. Now the girl was beginning to suffer the agony of death. She was begging for help from anyone. She had gotten fed up with the last of her strength, that someone would come to their rescue after all. She was still hoping that someone might come to the rescue. Now this door would open and they would finally be set free. However, such a miracle would not happen. The girl realized that she still tortured herself with vain hopes. Heroes are only part of the books read to children at bedtime. In life, everything is different. Before she died, the girl pondered over where they had gone wrong after all. She questioned herself. Why didn't their leader stop? Why couldn't she stop them? Now she blamed herself. The knight had already drawn his sword over her head and prepared to cut the girl in half, the blade already approaching her body at a rapid speed. It looked like it would be the last thing she would ever see in her life. In that case, Rank B Group should defeat this monster. But they couldn't handle it, so now they're all going to die. At the very least, let them be the only fools to overestimate themselves. She sat leaning against the cold wall, the cold crawling into her lungs. There was no more fear inside. She just accepted her unenviable fate. She could physically feel the knight drawing his sword even higher to finally bring it down and cut her in half. She closed her eyes and began to think of something pleasant, something that would give her peace before she died. The girl had already made peace with everything, and now, before her eyes were passing passages from her life, which was about to end. But suddenly, something not foreseen happened. The ball didn't go down, and the girl heard something fall to the floor with a resounding sound. It was the mask of a nameless knight. It fell on the tiled floor and rolled forward to the girl's feet. The same knight still stood before her, but now his head was next to her on the floor. A few seconds later, the bulky body shrouded in armor fell to the floor with a loud sound. The girl opened her eyes in surprise. She didn't understand what was wrong. Why was he dead? Who had saved her after all? She looked up and saw a familiar figure with a sword from the back. She immediately recognized her familiar Rin. He was standing with his back turned to her, staring confidently ahead. After a few seconds, he turned around, smiling ironically. He apologized for being late. The girl opened her eyes even wider. She hadn't expected him to be the one to come to her rescue. A few hours before, the guy had been standing upstairs exchanging information with the other adventurers. Looks like the monsters on the surface have been completely exterminated. Well, the townspeople were safe now. The guy told Yui that he was going to the dungeon. Would she go with him? The girl was stunned at the offer. I didn't know what to say. After a few seconds, she pulled herself together. Out of preparedness, she replied that she would of course go along with him. She's an adventurer too, after all. Confidence lit up in her eyes. The guy was surprised. This girl was of a low level, but she had a lot of strength. She had treated nearly 20 wounded in the last hour. Considering her level, she'd already done more than normal, even counting the MP potions. All this time, the girl had been tending to the wounded and helping them recover. In principle, it was expected since she was walking through such dungeons. Okay, we had to go. The girl readily pointed her finger in the direction of the dungeon entrance. She was determined now. She had no fear inside her. She was ready to help in any way she could. Near the entrance of the dungeon, I had many adventurers piled up. There were high-ranked groups here. They had come here to help deal with the monsters that had broken out. We had to hurry. The dungeon was already starting to collapse. More casualties couldn't be allowed to happen. Soon they approached their destination. Seeing a lot of people here, the guy was greatly surprised. What the hell? Noticing an adventurer in shining armor, he recognized a member of the Evening Moon. They had summoned a high-ranking group to deal with the dungeon. If so, then things would go much better. The guy walked up to them and apologized for disturbing them. The two boys stopped talking to each other and gave him worried looks. The protagonist asked, "What happened here?" There was some kind of incomprehensible atmosphere in this place. He had never felt like this before. One of the guys got distracted from his conversation and looked at him carefully. After what he told him, the boy's eyes widened with surprise and horror. It turned out that Kazami and his group were already in the boss's room. At that moment, it was as if something inside him had turned upside down. They're going to die in there. He heard from the group that went to defeat the boss that the doors had closed about 10 minutes ago. The boss room could only be infiltrated with a movement skill. Most likely, the Uniqueness Queen was fighting there now. Maybe they wanted to challenge the boss from the beginning. Given the nature of their leader and his druggies, they would have done it for their popularity. It's silly, but not impossible. Each of them has unique skills, as well as a level above 2. Wait a minute. Something suddenly hit him. A horrible thought pierced my head. Where's Ray? No way. You can't go down there at her level. She's not strong enough to fight that boss. He looked around for the girl, but there was no sign of her. The man from the squad looked at the protagonist in surprise. He didn't know who Ray was. However, he saw 5 people walking in that direction. The man pointed to the entrance of the dungeon. Finally, the kid's starting to get the truth. Damn it, I should have thought faster, so that idiot put her in there. Now the dungeon is in the final stages of destruction. They don't have time to delay. The boss will come out soon, and then it will be almost impossible to deal with him. They must hold him here. But it wasn't that simple. The man gritted his teeth. The situation was getting hotter by the second. The longer the dungeon will stay there inside, the stronger he becomes. Right now, he's probably incredibly strong. It takes a large group with highly ranked players to defeat him. Surely those men must have lost long ago and lie dead in the depths of the dungeon. There was a hopefulness in his voice. At that moment, the guy thought of his friend who had gone inside with them, and now she was probably dead too. But the guy tried his best to push those thoughts away from him. He frowned and in a serious voice told Yui that he would be right back. There was no backing down. His voice was firm, but the girl still didn't understand what he was up to. A look of worry flashed across her face. I did not hesitate for a second. The guy rushed as hard as he could, and people tried to stop him, but he did not listen to them. Now he had only one thought in his head: to get to the room with the boss and save them. Time was running out in seconds. It's going to be pretty hard to get in. However, you can't reveal yourself. He would pretend to enter the dungeon. It was necessary to keep his secret on top of all this. If people found out that he had this unique ability, there would surely be trouble. But still, he dared to use dungeon movement. He accumulated all his magic power, and after a second, he was inside. The man, who was one of the group members, rushed after him to stop this madman. But it was almost impossible to catch up with him. The guy was moving between floors using his skill. It's okay, they should win. Their squad's abilities are incredible. They should be able to pull it off. It was hope beating in the guy's chest, his strength. He hoped with his last strength that everything would end well. His heart was beating at a redoubled rate. It was necessary to come to the rescue as soon as possible. Soon he was already studying in the boss's room, and what he saw made his heart shudder. Ray was sitting leaning against the wall. She didn't move. Apparently her strength had already left her. The nameless knight was standing in front of her, and had already drawn his huge sword to cut the poor girl down. The guy didn't make it in time at the last moment now. If he doesn't do something, his friend will die. But fortunately, no one had died yet. He gathered all his will into a fist and prepared to attack. He could save them. The boy drew his nameless sword and swung with all his might to strike the knight. He jumped high up and drew his heavy sword, but right now, he couldn't feel its weight. The main task now was to save the poor girl. The knight was already bringing his sword down on her body. Just seconds more and it would all be over. But fortunately, the guy didn't make it in time. The nameless knight sword, and the head separated from the body. At the last second, he managed to prevent a terrible outcome. Ray looked at him dumbfounded, something she hadn't expected. The girl was ready to accept her death, but when she saw her friend, she was relieved. At last, she had come to her aid. At that moment, she thought that miracles do happen. The protagonist looked at her over his shoulder and smiled, apologizing for being late. Now, things were going to go their way. They needed to defeat the boss so that it wouldn't. And while the members of the squad were out, all hope was in the protagonist. The girl shifted her exhausted gaze to him and looked at him hopefully. Now she had no strength even to say a word. She could only sit and watch in silence. The situation was bad. The girl was completely exhausted, and he needed to find a way to give her some strength. He immediately pulled out his inventory and started rummaging through it to find a revitalizing potion. He couldn't wait a second. Soon he found the item he needed and brought the small bottle to the lips of the girl who was barely breathing. It's quite an effective medicine. I need her to take it immediately. If her level is below 1,000, she will easily regain her full health. Everyone will be fine. Now he's here. The guy looked at her with hope and relief. She was still alive, but her strength was gradually leaving her. The girl coughed but drank the medicine nonetheless. It tasted pretty nasty. Still a little coming to her senses, in a weak voice, she asked the guy, why did he come here? She still couldn't believe her happiness, that things wouldn't turn out so badly. The guy replied that there were things that needed to be done right now. His voice sounded confident and firm. As she listened to this, hope began to rise in her heart. As soon as she could move, have him give everyone a drink of this potion. He gave a few more vials, and the girl gratefully accepted them. They stood there for a few seconds, looking at each other with perplexed looks. She tried to gather her thoughts, because just now she was on the verge of death, and now she had the only thread of hope. The boy stood there, looking at her with a look of warmth and concern. He looked at the boss. He was level 4, God. He's so strong that it makes me want to run away. But right now there was no escape, and he had no intention of retreating at all. The guy put his will into his fist and prepared for battle. Before his eyes he changed. His face flashed with confidence and excitement. The monster looked at him with bloodshot eyes. He was ready to slaughter his victims when he was suddenly interrupted, and now the monster was furious. The boy raised his sword and looked at it with a smile. He hadn't shown himself again after that battle with the nameless knight. Now it was his time. He looked at the tip of his sword, which glittered playfully in the light of the dungeon. The monster became even more enraged and swung his huge axe, looking down at the guy. The huge pig-like monster let out a roar that could only be heard in the underworld. The boy pointed the tip of his sword at it. Now it was time for battle. He didn't have an ounce of fear inside him. He was now ready to fight the monster at full strength. This was not only a challenge to save his friend's life, but a challenge to himself. Now, he would show him how to fight a lower level. Ray still couldn't regain consciousness. Her strength was too weak even to get up off the ground. She only had to silently watch in amazement as her friend fought the monster that outnumbered him by several times. Therefore, immediately, not even a second, pushed off the ground, and at a tremendous speed ran straight at the monster. Even the air itself seemed to be filled with electricity during this battle. From the outside, they looked like David and Goliath fighting for life and death. The monster roared and swung its huge axe, the tip of which had so recently struck terror into the air. But the boy, small in comparison with the monster, ran at him, fearlessly thrusting his sword forward. This picture was so striking that the girl was speechless for a second. The battle promised to be bloody. There would be only one winner. Not only the life of the protagonist, but the lives of his friends depended on this exodus. Therefore, he could not lose. The guy ran straight at the monster. Now he didn't know what fear was. In his hands, he had the cold hilt of his sword. It gave him confidence. Although he realized that this sword had some nuances, but now it didn't matter to him. He deftly jumped aside and swung his sword, hitting the monster right in the stomach, his armor cracking. The monster roared. He still managed to strike. Shards of armor flew in different directions. The dungeon boss grinned his ugly mouth and looked at the boy with bloodshot eyes. At this time, the boy did not waste a moment and struck one by one. His breathing had evened out, and now he was completely focused on victory. When fighting such a monster, there was no room for error. Just one blow could cost him his life. He understood that very well. The blows came one after another. The opponents were as strong as each other. The boy tried his best to break through the monster's armor, but it was incredibly strong. At some points, the sword would just bounce off them to the sides. The guy could feel the recoil. Sometimes he gripped the hilt of the sword even tighter to keep it from slipping out of his hands. The protagonist panted heavily. It was harder than he thought. One hit would be enough for him to say goodbye to his life. Even if he increased the radius of his attacks, it wouldn't have much effect. As the beast prepared to strike back, it roared with its toothy maw. Now the protagonist had only one battle strategy: hit and run away, the only way in which one could win in his case. The monster was terribly strong and tough. You had to be careful and think of every move you made to avoid falling victim to a fleeting blow. In addition to its size, despite being huge, the monster was incredibly fast. Rin looked back. Ray had already regained consciousness and was helping the rest of the men. All the squad members were lying almost breathless. This battle had exhausted them a lot, and now they needed to be brought back to their senses. For now, the protagonist needed to provide some time for the girl to bring everyone else to their senses. Ray watched it all from the sidelines and admired the guy. And now, in her eyes, he looked like a true hero. A man who was able to defy an unknown creature that was many times his strength. The blows of the sword against the armor rang out. The monster was holding back almost all the blows. It seemed like it was taking no damage at all. Watching from the sidelines, the girl didn't understand how this was even possible. She didn't recognize her buddy. It seemed like he was a completely different person. His movements were quick and precise. All this time, she doubted that the guy could defeat him. But now she saw how he moved like a bullet. The monster didn't have time to strike him at all. The girl remembered that a week ago they were on the same level. And now he was fighting an enraged boss on equal footing. It was unbelievable. What level was this guy? How did he manage to acquire such incredible strength in such a short time? After all, their entire squad was unable to deal with the boss. And now this guy is single-handedly fighting back. But then the girl started to realize something. Wait a minute, there was definitely something wrong here. She was thinking. They had one break and it was pretty weak. The girl began to recall events from the past. She remembered the words of her leader. Perhaps he would tell her his name. His name was Amane Rin. He was a terrible adventurer, with a unique ability to move in a dungeon. Finally, the girl began to realize something. Her eyes widened and her breathing hitched. Her attention stopped at the name of the ability, Dungeon Moves. As the name suggests, one could move around in the dungeon with ease, not even needing to enter through the boss's door to get to his room. But where did this growth speed come from? This was a question that kept her on her toes. She thought about it even more, and began to search inside her head for answers. She really wanted to know how this guy, who had been talked about so unflatteringly, had been able to achieve such incredible success. Something was definitely wrong. She had to find out, no matter what. The girl began to remember the strange behavior of her acquaintance. She remembered how he bit his fingers nervously when he talked to her. She remembered that he said he had already cleared a dungeon yesterday, so today was his day off. It just can't be. If what he said then was true, then he has... The girl finally realized it. She couldn't come to her senses. So if what she's guessing is true, this guy has more potential than anyone in the world. Now he can level up almost indefinitely. At this moment, the main character was fighting the boss and didn't even notice anything around him. They were in some crazy dance, a deadly dance in which there could be only one outcome. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide open. She couldn't believe that this was really possible. Is this guy really that strong? But in any case, she must find out if they were to survive. Rin fought the monster and struck one after another, but Lord was able to defend himself skillfully because he had a level 4,000. Ray folded her hands and looked at her friend pleadingly. Right now, all she wanted was for this guy who had come to her rescue to win. He was the only one she hoped for. If he failed, they would all just die here. At this time, the guy, without noticing anything around him, was fighting the monster. He landed on the ground with a loud sound. He realized he was weak. With the monsters outnumbering him, he realized one thing. Emotions on the battlefield are unnecessary. They don't get in the way of concentration. And because a man's anger or joy can cause him to miss a shot, you have to be completely focused on the battle. You can't make mistakes. You had to let go of all your feelings. Anger, joy, anxiety. If he didn't, his fate would be decided here and now. Even the fear that had possessed him until now had to be cast away. The soul must be empty and the head must be cold. Only cold calculation has a place here, only it can ensure victory. Rin shifted his gaze to the monster now. It had to be destroyed for this not to be. And from the monster's stinking mouth dripped a slimy, slimy saliva. By all means, he must win. Concentrate completely on the enemy. Pay no attention to anything else. The creature stared at him with its lifeless eyes. That was his specialty. His advantage. Weak men put everything on the line to win. The guy started swinging his sword with double the speed and power. It was as if a whirlwind of blades had formed around him. With fury, he looked at his opponent. Now, his heart overflowed with hatred and the desire to win. He thought of his friends who had been in danger so recently. The guy channeled all his anger and hatred into his punch. Right now his main target was the boss. However, that becomes the worst fear. Putting everything on the line can also lose everything. But now, there was no thinking. He had to act. Movement had to be automatic. The roar of the monster brought him out of his thoughts. You had to let go of everything. Free his head for the battle. He rushed forward, his speed was simply monstrous. The boy couldn't see anything around him. All his attention was narrowed to one point, to one opponent, on the victory over whom depended his life, and the lives of people dear to him. The monster looked at him with its lifeless eyes and bared its teeth. He swung his axe and stomped his foot with such force that the earth began to split, and fragments of stones flew straight at the protagonist. But he saw it all, and it was not difficult for him to dodge the stones. Since that's the case, it's to choose a different battle tactic. The guy applied a search for the enemy. It was necessary to distribute his strength so as not to get hit, and to make accurate quick strikes. Only in this way would he be able to win. It was necessary to put everything on one blow. Otherwise, he had no choice. In other words, he could sense everything around him, even the rocks flying at him. Thanks to this sense, the guy started maneuvering around the flying rocks and none of them could hit the target. The monster looked at him questioningly. The monster didn't understand how this kid could move with such speed. He's only human. The monster let out a wrenching growl and prepared to attack again. He tossed his axe and it flew high into the air. At that moment, the monster folded his arms into a lock and swung around, ready to strike and swat the boy with one of his powerful blows. If he didn't dodge, he would be left with only a bloody stain. The girl looked at the whole thing with horror and shouted for the lad to be careful. Horror flashed in her eyes. Right now, she realized that the guy wouldn't be able to dodge such an attack. Without the iron axe, the monster's speed was much greater. The girl's breath hitched now. She realized that the guy was on the verge of death. She had to do something. At this time, and the protagonist wasn't worried at all. He smiled, too bad. But he had already seen this coming. The guy bounced to the side and with all his might, pushed off the cracked ground with his feet. With a deft dodge to the side, he remained unharmed, and the monster plunged his huge fist straight into the ground. There was a monstrous impact, and the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath his feet. Dust began to fall from the ceiling. Rock fragments flew in different directions. The monster had missed, but the boy was unharmed. He ran in the other direction, and the monster raised his fist and roared with a frenzied stare in the direction of the protagonist. The monster was angry. He couldn't catch that annoying little moth. Slowly, the boss's patience began to run out. The boy had done it, but now he had to get the timing right and put all his strength into his kick. He pushed off the ground so hard that it sagged under his feet. Now it was his turn to strike. He screamed and looked at the monster with all the hatred he could muster. He jumped up to the monster's jaw, and with all his might, he punched his fist right into the monster's jaw. The monster staggered and blood spurted out of its mouth. Surprisingly, the strength of this kid's punch was unbelievable now. The monster did not expect such an exodus of events. His mind went blank. But the boy was in no hurry to waste time. He immediately grasped his sword to deliver a decisive blow and finally defeat the monster. Naturally, that wasn't all. Guy had prepared well. I knew that this monster was so easy for me to defeat. He looked at the beast with eyes full of excitement. Now he wasn't afraid at all because he realized his superiority. The beast no longer posed any danger to him. He saw it as a fun game where he was proving his strength to himself. It was the perfect opportunity to show what he was capable of. After all, he'd been considered weak all this time. And now he would prove it. The sword appeared in his hands, the cold hilt resting in his hand. He was used to feeling the weight of the ball in his hand. There was only one last strike left to make, and the beast would be defeated. In general, this battle lasted only a few seconds, but for the guy, time began to flow differently. Everything slowed down around him. He acted as if in slow motion. He anticipated the boss's every move. His speed was so monstrous that the monster couldn't even keep up with him. It was time for the final blow. He started swinging his sword, striking one after another. With all his strength, he struck the monster time after time. Now his body was experiencing a monstrous overload, but he didn't feel it. All he was thinking about was the safety of his friends. His body was at its limit, but right now, that was not a hindrance to him. The boy screamed, putting into that scream all his hatred, all his pain accumulated over the years, all his strength that he had worked so hard to achieve. He was almost close to the back of the monster's head to deliver a devastating blow. The monster didn't notice him, and this was the perfect opportunity to end it once and for all. Guy already had his sword drawn. The blade was ready to slice through the monster's hard flesh. There was the sound of his armor sharpening. He still managed to hit it in the back of the head, but that wasn't all. A few more efforts were needed to finally finish this battle. The boy gritted his teeth and put all his remaining strength into it. The beast roared, its eyes bloodshot. It had never felt such pain before. Its teeth opened, and out of it came a scream of more despair than ever before. But the huge boar was not going to give up so easily. He tensed his whole body and threw the boy aside. The protagonist flew away, almost losing his balance. The monster raged and roared with all his might. The boy barely slowed down in time, leaving columns of dust behind him. The boar grasped his axe and swung it to finally nail the man. The guy was breathing heavily, his thoughts confused. This blow wasn't the decisive one after all. He had to think of another way, but his strength was fading. The monster, it turned out, had only gotten angrier. He roared and held his huge axe in his hands, ready to attack again. This battle was slowly dragging on. Rin bounced off and stopped right in front of the monster that continued to rampage. From this angle, one could see how huge this monster was. One of its legs was the size of a man's height. The guy held his sword, thrusting it forward and prepared to attack again. This battle wasn't over yet. The girl watched it all from the sidelines, but she had no way to influence the outcome of the battle. She was very scared. She had never seen adventurers so strong that they could challenge a high-level dungeon boss like this. She saw the monster's eyes fill with blood, and at that moment she realized that something terrible was about to happen. But she realized that the guy had everything under control. The dust cleared and there was no one at the spot where the protagonist had just stood. He jumped high up. The monster couldn't find him. Ray shifted a startled and surprised look to the side, trying to find her comrade. At this time, the guy thought it over, and jumped so high that he was almost under the ceiling of the boss's room. The monster lost sight of him, and that gave him a chance to concentrate and redirect his attack. The monster searched the guy's eyes, unable to find him in any way. At this time, he gripped his ball tighter and prepared to make a final attack. Rin grouped up and pushed off the wall with tremendous force. Now, all he had to do was get close enough to the monster to end this once and for all. He pushed off and put all his strength into that push. He had no margin for error. The monster finally noticed him and shifted its surprised gaze to the protagonist, who was already flying at full speed to slay the creature. Now, it would be decided. One blow will end the battle. His eyes blazed with rage. It was all useless. No matter how the monster defended himself, he would still break through his defenses. But the monster was not going to give up. As if sensing it, he thrust his axe forward and roared. Stinking saliva began to drip from its mouth again. The guy spun in a deadly whirlwind. It was as if he was covered in a multitude of blades that were ready to crash into the monster's body and slash him through. Its speed was so great that it was impossible to see the guy. Now it would be decided. A crushing blow had to be struck. He put all the power, all the energy he'd been holding back all this time into his sword. Now, he would be finished. The boy shouted, and in that shout there was a mixture of rage and battle. There was the sound of tearing flesh. He had struck after all. No one even had time to notice, but it was over. The guy landed a few meters away from the monster. He was still standing there for a while, not understanding what had happened. After a few seconds, the monster's head began to separate from its body. After that, it fell to the ground with a loud sound. Now it was definitely over. The huge pig's head was lying on the ground now. This thing wouldn't harm anyone. The girl stood there and didn't realize how it was already over. She could not believe what was happening. She could not believe that the danger had passed, and they had survived. At the same time, she was incredibly happy. Happy that they had succeeded. The monster's body fell to the ground with a loud thud, and now it was over. The girl looked at it all with dazed eyes, but inside her was an incredible joy. The guy was standing a little far away,